She was 24 and empty. No car, no home, no wedding ring, just a canvas satchel and $7.19 she had saved by selling her winter coat behind a laundromat in Manistee. And with that money, she bought a honey extraction house leaning in the fruit country outside Traverse City, Grand Traverse County, Michigan, where the place had fallen off township maps in 1978. One cedar wall had bowed outward like a tired rib. The roof let rain fall through in 3 patient places. The county had condemned it since 1996 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the hollow drum of a cast-iron honey extractor, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 50 years, was $33,000 in cash and a map that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sienna Mae Voss had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she had learned the art by degrees. The way some children learn birdsong without naming the bird. She learned how to read a room before she entered it. She learned which floorboards complained, which door latch could be eased open without the brass tongue striking the plate, which adult silence meant ordinary fatigue, and which one meant a storm beginning somewhere behind the eyes. By 9, she could carry a glass of water across a kitchen without letting the ice touch the sides. By 11, she knew how to fold a paper grocery sack so it made no sound. They lived then in a rented duplex north of Muskegon, the kind with aluminum siding and a narrow strip of grass worn bare by tenants crossing to the bins. In April, the lake wind came under the doors. In August, the windows swelled and refused to close. Her mother, Lydia, kept geraniums in chipped clay pots and rotated them toward the light each morning before work. Her father was a framed photograph in the hallway, a man in a seed cap holding Sienna when she was too young to remember the weight of his hands. He had died in a dairy truck accident outside Ludington before she could make a memory sturdy enough to keep. The photograph made him both present and absent. The glass caught every passing lamp. Some evenings, when Sienna padded down the hall in socks, she saw only her own thin face laid over his, as if the picture had been waiting to return her glance. Lydia worked wherever hours were available, a bakery before dawn, a chiropractor's front desk 3 afternoons a week, seasonal packing work when cherries came in, her hands red at the cuticles from sorting fruit that would be shipped east under labels showing orchards brighter than anything the workers saw. She was not unkind to Sienna. That made the later betrayals harder to name. She braided her daughter's hair carefully before school, tied ribbons with hands that smelled of dish soap and flour, and sometimes when money came right for a week, brought home a single peach wrapped in tissue from the market. They would split it after supper. Lydia cut the peach with a paring knife. Half for the mother, half for the daughter, the pit held in her palm like a polished secret. She never ate first. She never took the larger half. Sienna remembered this long after she forgot entire years of school. When Lydia remarried, the house changed by inches. Mason Calder arrived first as a pair of work boots by the back door, then as a man's jacket hooked over a chair, then as a voice allowed to be tired in every room. He was a contractor when work came, a repairman when it did not, and a man who kept all his receipts in cigar boxes he never balanced. He did not shout at the beginning, he merely corrected. The sugar belonged on the left shelf, not the right. The TV volume was too high. The porch light should not be left on for strangers to see. A girl Sienna's age ought to know better than to stand with her arms crossed. He brought order with him, or the appearance of it. New locks, a rule about shoes, a rule about dinner, a rule that all mail went into the woven basket beside his chair, where he opened envelopes with a pocket knife and flattened bills under his thumb. Lydia seemed relieved at first, as though a man naming rules meant the world could be kept from falling through the roof. She said his habits came from hardship. She said he meant well. She said Sienna should try to see the good in him. Sienna tried. Children do. But goodness that must be searched for in every hour becomes a kind of labor, and after a while, as child grows weary of digging with bare hands, there was one place where Mason's order did not reach. Every other weekend from May through October, Lydia drove Sienna north to her great-aunt Ruth Voss, who lived in a faded farmhouse outside Empire, not far from the Sleeping Bear Dunes where the wind rearranged the sand with the patience of scripture. Ruth was Lydia's aunt by marriage, though the family treated kinship as something that could be stretched or cut according to convenience. She was small and square-shouldered, with silver hair pinned low, amber drops of resin on nearly every apron she owned, and hands that looked blunt until they picked up a frame of bees. Then they became exact. Ruth kept 27 hives in a long meadow edged with sumac and wild apple. Behind the farmhouse stood a cedar shed with a tin roof, a coal stove, and a screened door patched so many times the wire looked stitched. That was the honey house. It was not large, but every inch of it had purpose. Uncapping knives hung on nails by size. Smokers stood on a shelf above burlap sacks and pine shavings. Frames waited in wooden stacks, each one built by hand, each corner cleanly joined. There were glass jars, wax moulds, buckets with spigots, strainers, veils, hive tools filed thin at the edge, and a yellow ledger where Ruth wrote dates with a schoolteacher's care. Sienna's first tasks were modest. Sweep the threshold. Hold the smoker bellows while Ruth packed the chamber. Carry empty jars from the pantry. Stay still when bees circled her veil. Do not swat. Do not jerk away. Let the bee decide you are nothing worth troubling. The weekends acquired a ritual so steady that Sienna began to measure childhood by them. Saturday morning, they checked the hives before heat made the bees cross. Ruth lit the smoker with curls of cedar shavings and one twist of newspaper, then waited until the smoke cooled to a pale drift. She would tap the hive body once with the heel of her hand, not to frighten the colony, but to announce herself as she put it. She moved the outer cover, then the inner cover, then eased the frames one at a time, her body bent but never hurried. Sienna watched the comb lift into daylight, a sheet of gold and living motion. The bees covered it so densely the wood seemed to hum from within. Ruth would point with one knuckle. Brood there. Nectar there. See the queen's pattern? Child. She is not frantic. She knows her work. In the afternoons they did carpentry. Ruth showed Sienna how to square a hive box by checking corner to corner with a tape, how to set galvanized nails without splitting cedar, how to choose wood by smell and weight. Cedar was honest, Ruth said, because it told you when it was sound. Pine could pretend cedar gave itself away. If it had rot, you smelled it before the saw bit through. On Sundays after dinner, they rendered wax in a double boiler on the back stove. Ruth never let the heat climb past 180 degrees, too hot and the wax darkened, too fast and it carried impurities with it. They poured through cheesecloth into loaf pans and left the cakes to set under towels. The kitchen filled with a sweetness deeper than sugar, something floral and animal and faintly smoky, like summer remembered by a body that had lived through winter. Those evenings, Sienna slept in the front room under a crocheted blanket, windows open to crickets and the far hush of Lake Michigan. The whole farmhouse breathed, floorboards cooled. Jars clicked once in the pantry. Bees settled in their wooden rooms beyond the yard. No one asked her to explain her face. No one weighed her voice for disrespect. Ruth did not pry into the life Lydia had brought her from. She taught instead. Teaching was Ruth's mercy. The first time Sienna cried in the apiary, she was 13 and ashamed of a bruise darkening near her wrist where Mason had gripped too tightly while moving her away from his desk. Ruth saw it. She said nothing while they walked the rows. At the far hive near the sumac, she handed Sienna the smoker and pointed to a clump of clover. "Smoke is not force," Ruth said. "It is a request for calm." Sienna remembered the words because Ruth did not touch her bruise and did not call it by name. The sentence entered her like weather entering the soil. For years she believed it was about bees. Later she understood it was about every frightened creature that has ever learned to survive by becoming still. Calm could be invited, not commanded. Safety could not be beaten into a body. A person was not a hive to be pried open by rough hands. Ruth died in March of Sienna's 17th year. When the snow along the orchard roads had turned grey and the first skunks were coming up through roadside ditches, a neighbour found her seated at the kitchen table, one hand near the ledger, a cup of tea gone cold beside her. The doctor called it her heart. Lydia called it a blessing that she had not suffered. Mason called it inconvenient because the funeral fell on a Monday and he lost a day of work he had not wanted to do anyway. Afterward, the Voss relatives came like weather from County Sienna, had only seen on envelopes. They opened drawers, they carried boxes to trunks. A cousin from Kalamazoo took the hand tools because his son liked that sort of thing. An aunt took the ledger, though she had never kept bees and did not know the meaning of half the marks in the margins. The wax moulds disappeared. The veils disappeared. The cedar smoker with Ruth's thumb-polished handle was set aside for Sienna, then placed by mistake into the wrong pickup, then not returned. The farmhouse was sold before the lilacs bloomed. Sienna was given one thing no one else valued: a square of unbleached canvas, stained with wax and creased down the middle, used by Ruth for wrapping hive tools in winter. It smelled faintly of smoke, cedar and honey, though all three faded with the years. Sienna folded it into a satchel and sewed 2 handles from scrap denim. Lydia said it was not much, Mason said it was dirty. Sienna kept it anyway. At 18, she married Mason's nephew. His name was Cole Calder, and he had inherited the family's talent for turning concern into ownership. He was handsome in the plain way of a man who trusted mirrors. He worked in equipment financing and wore shirts pressed so sharply the sleeves looked able to cut paper. When they were courting, he spoke softly to Sienna in parking lots and carried bags without being asked. He listened when she told him about Ruth's hives and said he admired women who knew practical things. He bought her a jar of clover honey from a roadside stand and tied a blue ribbon around it. No one had done such a thing for her before. That was enough then. A ribbon on a jar can look like proof to a young woman trained to be grateful for crumbs. They rented a narrow house in Cadillac first, then moved west when Cole found better work near Traverse City. For a little while, Sienna believed she had crossed into a life with windows. She painted the kitchen pale yellow. She planted thyme and mint in coffee cans along the sill. She took a bookkeeping course online and found part-time work entering invoices for a farm supply office. On Sundays, she drove past orchards and imagined a row of hives under the trees, bees working apple blossom while the world remained exact and peaceful. Cole kept the checkbook because he was better with numbers. Then he kept the debit card so they would not overspend. Then he took her name off the farm supply account because the owner had looked at her too long during pickup. Then he explained that the car loan, the house lease, the furniture credit, and 2 private notes were all necessary steps toward building something. When letters came from banks, he opened them. When phone calls came from numbers Sienna did not recognize, he stepped onto the porch and lowered his voice. By 23, she had learned the pattern too late. The debts were joint where they could harm her and his alone where they might be hidden. Her signature had appeared on papers she remembered signing only because he had placed his hand over hers and said it was routine. There were liens, penalties, a cash advance, a consolidation loan, and that had consolidated nothing except his control. He never needed to raise his voice in public, that was his discipline. In front of neighbors, he called her sweetheart. At home, he corrected her breathing. She breathed too loud when she cried. She breathed too shallow when she lied. She breathed like someone looking for sympathy. He could turn a dinner plate 3 inches to the left and make it an accusation. He could read silence as defiance and speech as proof of ingratitude. Sienna grew careful. Careful women are mistaken for peaceful women by people who never ask what the carefulness costs. The night she left him was not dramatic. No storm broke over the roof. No lamps shattered. It was the 27th of September 2021, and rain had been falling since dusk with the steady indifference of a hand rinsing glass. Cole had fallen asleep in the recliner, 1 shoe on, 1 shoe off, the TV flashing blue over his open mouth. On the side table lay his phone, his keys, and a folded notice from the finance company saying the truck would be repossessed if payment was not received by noon Friday. Sienna stood in the doorway for a long while with Ruth's canvas satchel pressed against her hip. Into it she put 2 shirts, underwear, a toothbrush, a pair of socks, the paper copy of her birth certificate, a kitchen paring knife wrapped in a towel, and the jar of clover honey with the blue ribbon still knotted around its neck. The honey had sugared solid. She did not take it because of him. She took it because she had learned to separate the gift from the giver when survival required it. at the back door. Her hand shook once on the knob. Then it did not. She walked through the rain to a gas station 2 miles away and used the payphone beside the ice machine to call her mother. Lydia answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with sleep. Sienna said only that she needed a place to stay. She did not say the rest. The rest was too large for a phone cord and a rain-streaked pane of glass. Lydia let her in at 2:13 in the morning. For 4 days, Sienna slept on the sofa under a knitted throw and woke before dawn to fold it back into the basket. Mason had died the winter before from a stroke, which made the house feel less dangerous but not kinder. His chair remained in the living room. His cigar boxes remained on the shelf. Lydia moved around them as if they held bones. Cole came by twice and stood in the driveway, but Sienna did not answer the door. Lydia watched through the curtain. She said he looked thin. She said a marriage was complex. She said debt had a way of making men frightened. On the 5th morning, she placed Sienna's satchel beside the front door. It was October 3rd, 2021. The physical object Sienna remembered was not the satchel. It was the brown ceramic sugar bowl on the kitchen table, the one Lydia had owned since Sienna was little. A hairline crack ran from the rim to the base. Lydia turned it in both hands as though looking for the right place to hold something broken. Cole's truck idled in the road beyond the lilacs. Lydia did not look toward it. She looked at the sugar bowl. "You cannot stay here. Not one more night." 8 words spoken evenly, not cruelly. That was the shape of it. Cruelty would have given Sienna something to push against. Evenness left no handle. Lydia kept both hands on the sugar bowl and would not lift her eyes. The window behind her showed the driveway, the road, the waiting truck. A mother can betray without moving toward the door. She can do it by staying where she is. Sienna picked up the satchel. The jar inside struck softly against the paring knife. For a second, the sound was almost musical. On the porch, the morning smelled of wet leaves and exhaust. Cole's driver's side door opened. Sienna did not turn his way. She walked instead toward the corner, then past it, then down the county road with Ruth's canvas rubbing against her coat. No one called her name after she crossed the ditch. For 6 weeks, she moved through Michigan by bus. By rides, she accepted only from women, and by walking where roads had shoulders wide enough to make walking possible. She spent 2 nights in Ludington under the back awning of a closed bait shop, sleeping between stacked minnow buckets and a vending machine humming behind glass. She spent 3 nights in Manistee, where the laundromat stayed open until 11, and the attendant with hennaed hair let her sit by the dryers as long as she bought 1 cup of coffee from the machine. $7.19 became $6.44 after coffee and a day-old roll, then $5.69 after a bus to Frankfurt. In Frankfurt, she slept in the vestibule of a church whose red doors were locked, but whose outer storm doors held against the wind. A woman leaving choir practice saw her and came back with a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She did not ask for Sienna's story. She only said the nights were getting cold and placed the sandwich beside the satchel. In Beulah, Sienna washed her hair in the restroom sink of a county park after waiting until 2 fishermen drove away. In honor, she slept one night in a hay barn with permission from an apple grower's wife who stood at the kitchen door in a robe and said the barn had mice but no men. The hay held the day's warmth until nearly midnight. Then the cold came up through it, slow and deliberate, and Sienna tucked her hands under her arms and listened to the small scratchings beneath the boards. She learned which public bathrooms had hot water. She learned which clerks noticed too much. She learned that shame has weather patterns. Some mornings it lay over everything like fog. Other mornings, hunger burned it off by 9 and left only the need to keep moving. Near Benzonia, she traded her winter coat to a woman behind a laundromat for $10 and a hooded sweatshirt with a bleach mark on one sleeve. The coat was wool navy missing a button. The woman counted the money twice before handing it over. Sienna almost refused. Then she looked at the sky and understood that pride was a luxury heavier than any coat. By the time she reached Traverse City, the orchards were bare. Rows of cherry trees stood black and exact against pewter fields. Farm stands had closed or shifted to pumpkins and cider. The bay showed a hard line of silver under November cloud. She spent her first night there behind a medical office in a recessed doorway that smelled of damp concrete and cigarette smoke. Her satchel made a poor pillow. She slept in pieces, waking whenever tires passed on the wet street. The next morning, she entered the Traverse Area District Library, because libraries were the only public buildings where sitting could look like purpose. Warm air moved over her face as the doors opened. For a moment she could not walk farther. The smell of paper, carpet, radiator dust, and coffee from someone's covered cup seemed almost indecent in its gentleness. She went first to the restroom, washed her hands twice, pressed water over the back of her neck, and combed her hair with her fingers until it lay flat enough to pass. Then she found a table near the local history shelves and sat with her satchel between her feet. There are buildings in America that continue offering sanctuary long after churches have locked their doors. A library is one of them. It asks nothing at first but quiet. It lets the worn sit beside the rested. It lets a woman with no address open a newspaper and be, for an hour, simply a reader. Sienna read the classified pages because she needed work, though her eyes were tired enough that the print blurred at the edges. House cleaning, snow removal, seasonal packing, live-in aid references required, room to rent, no pets, first and last month, firewood split and delivered. Scrap metal wanted then. In the back of a county notice insert, under permitted disposal, structures for removal or restoration, she saw 4 lines boxed in black ink. Cedar Honey Extraction House. Former Voss Apiary Co-op Outbuilding. Quick claim transfer, $1. Restore or remove by county deadline. She stopped moving. The name Voss sat there in the newsprint like a hand placed flat on a table. Below it were directions, a parcel number, the county office address, and a note that all liabilities transferred with the deed. No utilities guaranteed, no occupancy certification, buyer responsible for taxes, code compliance, and demolition bond waiver. The words were meant to keep away fools, opportunists, and sentimental people without money. Sienna read the notice 3 times. A honey extraction house. Cedar. Voss? $1. She took the jar of sugared honey from her satchel and set it on the table beside the paper. The blue ribbon had faded to the color of washed sky, crystals pressed against the glass in pale, unmoving waves. She could almost hear Ruth's smoker sighing in the meadow, see the careful lift of a frame, the capped comb shining under bees. But memory is not shelter. A name is not a roof. A condemned building is not rescue simply because it knows an ancestor. She copied the parcel number on the back of a receipt she found in her satchel. Then she counted her money in her lap under the table. $7.19. That was after the coat, after the coffee, after the bus fare she had not taken because the weather had held. $7.19 in coins and a single wrinkled bill. $1 could buy the deed. That was the absurdity of it. $1 could also buy part of a sandwich, hot coffee, a few more hours of appearing normal. $1 could be survival measured in steam rising from a paper cup. She folded the newspaper notice with exact corners and tucked it into the satchel. For the rest of the day she did not leave the library except to stand outside under the overhang and eat half the peanut butter sandwich she had saved from Frankfurt. She read everything she could find on quitclaim deeds, condemned structures, demolition orders, and rural tax forfeiture. Much of it was beyond her. Some of it frightened her more than hunger. Words like liability and hazardous and occupancy appeared again and again, formal and cold. Still beneath the language, one plain fact remained. The county did not want the building. No one else had taken it. It was waiting inside a process designed to erase it. At closing, a librarian in a green cardigan approached her table and said they would be shutting down in 10 minutes. Her voice was gentle, but rules were rules, and Sienna understood rules. She gathered the notice, the receipt, the jar, and the satchel. Outside, the evening had gone blue and raw. Cars moved along Woodmere Avenue with their headlights on. Somewhere nearby, someone was baking bread or pizza, and the smell reached her with such force that she had to stop by the bike rack and close her hand around the strap of the satchel. She had planned to look for another doorway. Instead, she walked to the bus station and sat on a metal bench until the building closed. After that, she found an alcove behind a closed thrift store where cardboard had been stacked for recycling. She flattened 2 pieces, laid one under her and one over her legs, and kept the jar of honey inside her sweatshirt against her stomach so it would not freeze. All night. She woke to the same 4 lines. Cedar Honey Extraction House. Former Voss Apiary Co-op outbuilding. Quitclaim transfer $1. Restore or remove by county deadline. At dawn she went back to the library restroom, washed and braided her hair with fingers stiff from cold. She looked at herself in the mirror only long enough to see that she could pass through a county office without being escorted out. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips were cracked. The sweatshirt hung loose at one shoulder, but her eyes were clear enough. Ruth had always said bees did not care for panic. If Sienna was going to approach the last doorway left open to her, she would do it with her hands steady. She spent $1 on nothing that morning. That was the first decision. The second was stranger. She would not call Lydia. She would not call Cole. She would not ask any person who had watched her become smaller to tell her whether she was allowed to step toward a roof, even one condemned by law and weather. She would take the county at its printed word. She would bring her dollar to the clerk's office, ask the questions that had to be asked, sign only what she understood, and if the answer was no, she would still have $6.19 and the dignity of having tried. By 9, the sky had cleared to a thin November brightness. The bay shone between buildings in quicksilver flashes. Sienna walked toward the county offices with Ruth's canvas satchel against her hip and the folded notice in her hand, each step carrying her nearer to a cedar building she had never seen, a dead woman's surname printed in black ink, and a hollow machine waiting in the dark. The sidewalk outside the county building had been salted, though no snow had fallen yet, and the grains cracked under Sienna's shoes like sugar spilled on a kitchen floor. She paused before the glass doors, not from doubt, but because her hands had gone stiff around the folded notice. Across the street, a man in a fleece vest was unlocking a real estate office, turning the key with the care of someone who belonged to the morning. A delivery truck idled in front of a bakery. 2 women in long coats passed Sienna without looking at her, both carrying paper cups that gave off visible steam. Everything in that part of town seemed arranged for people who expected the day to open for them. Sienna shifted Ruth's canvas satchel higher on her shoulder and went in. Warmth struck first, then floor polish, then the faint copper smell of old elevators and damp wool. The lobby held a directory behind glass, a flag in one corner, a rack of brochures about recycling, soil erosion, veteran services and winter road safety. She read every line of the directory twice before finding the office named in the classified notice. Register of Deeds and Property Transfer. 2nd floor. She took the stairs because elevators required standing still with strangers. Halfway up, a man in a brown suit came down carrying a folder thick with papers. He nodded at her automatically, the kind of nod clerks and lawyers give the public without seeing faces. Sienna nodded back, grateful for the small invisibility. The hallway on the 2nd floor was narrow, with framed maps of Grand Traverse County hung along one wall. The maps showed townships, lakes, roads, plats, and boundaries that had outlived the hands that drew them. She stopped before one dated 1954. The county looked both exact and mysterious there. All those black lines crossing fields, marshes, orchards, and woodlots. All those names assigned to places that had once been only water, bee pasture, deer trails, and wind. The office door was half open. Inside, a woman sat behind a long counter beneath fluorescent lights. She wore a navy cardigan over a white blouse and had grey hair cut blunt at the jaw. Her glasses hung from a chain of tiny black beads. On the counter before her were a stapler, a brass stamp, a jar of pens, a box of tissues, and a nameplate polished at the edges by years of being moved for cleaning. Miriam Holt, Deputy Retrosfer. The woman looked up from a stack of forms. She had the face of someone who had spent her life deciding whether papers were in order and had learned, by practice, that paper could both save and ruin people. "Good morning," she said. Sienna crossed the room carefully, aware of the mud dried along the hems of her jeans. "Good morning, ma'am. What can I do for you?" Sienna placed the folded notice on the counter and smoothed it open with both hands. The paper had softened along the creases overnight. "I came about this property." Miriam Holt drew the notice toward her, read the boxed lines, and looked back at Sienna with no change in her expression except a slight narrowing around the eyes. She did not ask whether Sienna had made a mistake. That was a kindness, though a cautious one. "The honey house?" "Yes, ma'am." "You are interested in taking transfer?" "Yes, ma'am." Miriam set the notice flat. "Do you have identification?" Sienna opened the satchel and removed the birth certificate first by mistake, then found her state identification card tucked inside a library receipt. The card showed a version of her with fuller cheeks, smoother hair, and the uncertain half-smile of a woman trying not to offend the camera. Miriam took it, typed slowly, and compared the screen to the card. The office remained hushed except for keys clicking and a printer shifting somewhere behind a partition. A clock over the door showed 9:17. On a bulletin board near the copier, someone had pinned a child's drawing of a courthouse with a yellow sun above it. Beside it hung notices about recording fees, transfer tax exemptions, veterans benefits, and septic permit schedules. Sienna read them because waiting was easier when her eyes had work to do. Miriam returned the card. "You understand this is not a sale in the ordinary sense?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county is not warranting condition, habitability, utility service, water, septic, access beyond the recorded easement, structural soundness, or compliance with any current code?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the condemnation order remains attached to the structure until a county inspector signs off on improvements?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that if the structure is not stabilized before the demolition deadline, the county may remove it and assess the cost to the parcel?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there may be back taxes, debris, pests, mold, environmental hazards, rot, or other conditions not listed here?" "Yes, ma'am." Miriam let the last answer settle. "Do you understand that taking a building because it costs $1 can be more expensive than buying one that costs 50,000? Sienna did not look away. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk sat back slightly. Her chair made a short breath against the floor. She studied Sienna's face, then her satchel, then the folded newspaper notice, then her hands. Sienna had washed them at the library, but the knuckles remained reddened by cold. A faint line of dirt lay under one thumbnail. She curled her fingers inward, then made herself uncurl them. Miriam removed a folder from a lower drawer. The tab was labelled with a parcel number. Inside were photographs, notices, copies of letters, a tax record, and a typed sheet with 3 signatures at the bottom. Sienna saw the edge of one photograph and the suggestion of weathered boards, but Miriam covered it with another page before Sienna could make out the building. "There is a demolition bond waiver in this case," Miriam said. "The county commissioners approved it because the cost of administering the bond would exceed the value of the structure. That is unusual. It does not mean they believe the building is safe." "Yes, ma'am. You will need to sign acknowledgement of risk. You will need to pay the recording fee. The $1 transfer is separate." Sienna's mouth went dry. "How much is the recording fee?" Miriam looked at the form. The county waived the local filing charge under the nuisance abatement program. State fee is also waived on this class of transfer. You pay $1 consideration. No additional amount today. For a moment, Sienna heard only the lights overhead. They gave off a thin electric hum, like a hive very far away. "I have the $1, she said. "I expect you do." There was no mockery in the clerk's voice. That nearly undid her. Miriam turned several pages towards Sienna and began explaining them one by one. She used a blue pen to point but did not hurry. Quitclaim deed, liability acknowledgement, structure stabilization agreement, tax notice, Access description, demolition deadline, no warranties. The language was cold and exact, yet the clerk warmed it by translating each paragraph into ordinary speech. This means the county is giving you whatever interest it has, and no more. Yes, ma'am. This means if the roof falls in after you sign, the roof is yours. Yes, ma'am. This means no one from this office has walked through it in years. Yes, ma'am. This means you cannot live there legally until inspection, though I'm not the person who enforces occupancy. At that, she did not lift her eyes from the paper. Sienna heard what was said and what was not said. Yes, ma'am. The clerk placed a blank line under Sienna's name. Sign here. Full legal name. The pen was heavier than Sienna expected. It had a metal body and a small rubber grip split near the end. Her fingers hesitated before forming the S. She had signed so many papers in the past with Cole's hand nearby, his impatience travelling into her wrist. This time no one leaned over her. No one tapped the page. No one said routine. She wrote slowly. Sienna Mae Voss. Miriam watched the name appear. Something changed then. Not in the room. In the clerk. It was small enough that another person might have missed it. Her chin lifted a fraction. The beads on her glasses chain shifted when she drew a careful breath. She looked at the name, then at Sienna, then down at the folder tab. Voss, she said. Sienna tightened one hand around the pen. Yes, ma'am. Are you from the Voss family near Empire? My great-aunt was— What was her name? Sienna hesitated, because Ruth's name had always felt too private to hand across counters. But this counter had already taken her signature, and the question was spoken without greed. Ruth Voss. Miriam Holt sat very still. Ruth with the B place on Dune Road, she said, not asking. Yes, ma'am. The clerk removed her glasses and folded them on top of the folder. Her eyes without the lenses were softer, paler at the edges. My father bought honey from her every fall, buckwheat for himself, basswood for my mother. He said she was the only person in the county who would tell him not to buy a jar if it had started to ferment. A corner of Sienna's mouth moved, though it was not quite a smile. She came in here once, years ago, with a box of records tied in string. Old co-op papers. Mostly. She said family papers had a way of outliving family interest. Miriam looked back at the signed line. I wondered why this parcel had the Voss name on the old inventory. Sienna stood with the pen still in her hand. Did it belong to her? No, not directly, at least not by the time I saw the file. Miriam opened the folder and turned a page. It was part of a bee cooperative, fruit growers and small keepers. The county took the parcel after taxes went unpaid, and the structure was declared a nuisance. Most of the names in the chain are gone now. She paused over one document, reading silently. But there is a Ruth Voss listed as a correspondent in 1977. She objected to abandonment. Sienna swallowed. Her throat hurt when she did. That sounds like her. It does, Miriam said. For the first time, the clerk's hands moved less like instruments of office and more like hands belonging to a woman at a kitchen table. She squared the documents, aligned the deed under the brass stamp, and pressed down. The stamp landed with a heavy final sound, metal entering paper. Paper accepting its new burden. There, Miriam said. Recorded. Sienna removed the wrinkled dollar bill from the small pocket of the satchel. It had been folded twice and was soft as cloth. She placed it on the counter. Miriam did not put it immediately in the cash drawer. She set a receipt beside it, then reached for a county envelope and slid the deed copy inside. On the outside she wrote the parcel number, the road name, and her own initials. Then she took a yellow sticky note and drew directions in a square, practical hand. You will go north out of town, then west toward the old orchard roads, she said. Take M72 until you reach Grey Road. Follow that past the farm market with the green roof. When the pavement narrows, you will see an old lane marked Honey House Road, though the sign may be down. If you reach the walnut windbreak and the blue mailbox with no door, you have gone one property too far. How far is it? From here. On foot? Yes. Ma'am? Miriam looked at her shoes, then out the office window toward the pale sky. Too far. Sienna waited. About 9 miles by road. More if you miss the lane. I will not miss it. The clerk held the envelope a moment longer than necessary. There is a barn on Grey Road, just before the old Peterson orchard. Red siding. The family moved south, but the neighbour keeps hay there. If weather turns, the loft has stayed dry. I'm not advising trespass. Yes, ma'am, there is a pump behind the former farm market. It may still work. I'm not saying it has been tested. Yes, ma'am, if anyone asks why you are there, you show the deed, not the notice. Yes, ma'am. Miriam placed the envelope in Sienna's hands, and if the building feels unsafe, you leave it. A roof is not worth your life. Sienna looked down at the envelope, at the clerk's initials, at the county seal impressed through the copy. No, ma'am. Miriam then did a thing Sienna did not understand until later. She took the wrinkled dollar bill, wrote the parcel number in pencil on a small slip, wrapped the slip around the bill, and placed both not in the register drawer, but in the shallow middle drawer of her desk. The drawer balances better when the odd things are kept separate, she said. Sienna nodded as though that explained it. In a way, it did. She left the county building with the deed inside her satchel and the air outside brighter than when she had gone in. At the corner, she stopped beneath a leafless maple and took inventory. $6.19. 1 deed, 1 jar of sugared honey, 2 shirts, a paring knife, a birth certificate, Ruth's canvas, no coat, no lawful place to sleep, a building that might fall in if the wrong wind touched it. North wind moved down the street and slipped under the sweatshirt. She started walking. Traverse City in late November had not yet surrendered entirely to winter, but it had begun putting away its gentler things. Patio chairs were stacked behind restaurants. The planters outside shops held brown stems and decorative kale darkened by frost. She passed a diner with red vinyl booths visible through fogged windows, a hardware store window showing snow shovels and stovepipe, a barber shop with a striped pole turning, though no one sat inside, a bakery where round loaves cooled on racks behind glass, and a thrift store with a cardboard sign reading winter coats half price. She did not stop at the thrift store. To stop would have been to count again. A pharmacy opened as she passed. A man swept leaves from the threshold of a closed antique shop. Farther west, the town loosened into parking lots, then storage buildings, then houses set back from the road. She followed the directions from Miriam's yellow note, checking road signs against the careful square handwriting. The satchel grew heavier after the 3rd mile. Her shoulders began to ache in the old places where fear had once sat like a second garment. By noon she was beyond the edge of town. Traffic thinned. The bay disappeared behind trees and low hills. Orchards began to take shape on either side of the road. Their rows disciplined and bare. Trunks painted white at the base, limbs pruned back into open hands. Here and there, windfall apples lay in the grass, darkening into the soil. Crows lifted from a field when she passed, complaining once before settling farther off. At a roadside farm stand with a green metal roof, the windows were boarded for the season. Painted signs still promised cherries, peaches, cider, honey, pumpkins, asparagus, maple syrup, though all the tables were empty. Behind the building she found the pump Miriam had mentioned. Its handle was iron and colder than stone. She worked it 10 times before water came up in a brown cough, then clear. She drank from cupped hands until her teeth hurt. There was an apple crate by the back wall. She sat on it and ate the second half of the peanut butter sandwich, breaking it into small pieces so it would last longer. Across the road, a field rolled toward a line of walnut trees. Their branches were black and complicated against the sky. Beyond them, she could see the raised backs of old beehive boxes, grey with weather, left in a row beside a collapsed shed. The sight halted something in her. Not because they were usable, they were not. The lids had tilted. Grass had grown through the stands. One hive body leaned open at the corner, and old comb, empty and dark, showed like exposed ribs. But even ruin has a shape, and the shape was familiar enough that Sienna stood and crossed halfway to the road before stopping herself. The deed in her satchel seemed to weigh more than everything else. She walked on. The sky lowered during the afternoon, clouds thickening into a flat pewter lid. At one point a farm dog came down a gravel drive barking, head low, tail stiff, a black and white animal with mud on its legs and one ear torn at the edge. Sienna stopped, turned slightly away, and lowered her eyes the way Ruth had taught her around unsettled animals. Do not challenge fear, do not feed it motion. The dog barked 6 more times, then sniffed the air, sneezed, and retreated to the porch. "Good dog," Sienna said softly, after it was gone. By 4, the cold had sharpened. Her sweatshirt was too thin for the wind moving over the open fields. She kept one hand wrapped around the strap of the satchel and the other tucked under her opposite arm. A pickup slowed once, the driver looking through the passenger window, then drove on. She was relieved and ashamed of the relief. At a mailbox with peeling blue paint and no door, she stopped. The yellow note said she had gone too far. She turned back. The lane was barely a lane. The sign lay in the ditch, one post broken and the other still bolted to a green board, so weathered that the words could be read only when the light struck sideways. Honey House Road. A thin track passed between walnut trees and sloped toward a stand of cedar and wild apple. Grass had grown up the middle, frosted at the tips. Tire ruts held water skinned with ice. No house was visible from the road. No chimney smoke. No marker that anyone had come that way recently. Sienna stepped over the fallen sign and entered the lane. After the open road, the windbreak felt close and almost watchful. Walnut shells cracked underfoot. Dry leaves dragged along the ground behind her, stopping when she stopped. The trees on either side had grown without trimming, limbs crossing overhead, narrowing the sky to strips. She walked slowly because the ruts were uneven and her feet had begun to hurt in a flat, distant way. Halfway down the lane, she passed a sagging fence with 2 rails gone. On the far side stood a neighbouring farmhouse, its windows lit, smoke rising from a brick chimney in a steady column. A woman in a red jacket carried a bucket toward a chicken coop. She saw Sienna and stopped. Sienna lifted the county envelope. The woman stared a moment, then lifted 2 fingers from the bucket handle, neither welcome nor warning, and went on. Beyond the fence, the lane curved left. The honey house appeared not all at once, but in pieces. First the roofline, low and uneven beneath cedar branches, then a chimney of fieldstone, blackened at the cap, then the front wall, made of cedar boards turned silver by years of rain, each board running vertical and fastened with square nails dark as seeds. It was longer than Sienna had expected and narrower, perhaps 24 feet by 32, built like a workhouse rather than a dwelling, with a front room facing the lane and a lower rear addition set toward the marsh. The roof was cedar shake under patches of rusted tin, both failing in different languages. A stovepipe elbow jutted from the back addition but had pulled loose from its bracket. One corner rested lower than the others. The foundation stones had shifted along the east wall. Above the front door hung the remains of a hand-painted sign. Most letters had peeled away, but enough remained for the eye to supply what weather had taken. Voss Apiary Co-op, Extraction House. A metal honeybee had once been screwed beneath the words. Only its outline remained, a rust stain shaped like wings. Sienna stood in the lane and did not move. The place had the stillness of a room holding its breath. Not empty stillness, not peaceful, waiting stillness. The kind found in cupboards after a funeral, barns after the last animal is sold, schoolhouses where chalk dust remains though no children return. A stillness made not of absence but of work interrupted. She walked the perimeter before touching the door. Ruth had taught inspection from the outside in. Look first at how a structure meets the ground. The north sill was soft in 2 places. The west wall had pulled from square maybe 3 inches. A vine had climbed through a gap under the rear eave and entered the building, its dead stems visible through a cracked window. The chimney leaned slightly, but not, she hoped, fatally. Near the back, a downspout lay in the grass like a shed snakeskin. There were 8 windows. 3 had no glass. 4 were cracked. One, on the east wall beneath the walnut branches, was intact and wavy, old enough to bend the world behind it. She touched that pane with 2 fingers and found it colder than the air. No well, house was visible. A collapsed outhouse stood beyond the rear addition under sumac. Farther back, the land dipped toward marsh, where brown reeds shivered and a narrow creek moved under a skin of ice. The water made a careful sound over stones, not loud, but persistent. At the front door, a county notice had been nailed through the upper panel in a plastic sleeve. Condemned, unsafe structure. The red letters had faded to pink. Someone had tried the door before her and splintered the jamb near the latch. A padlock hung open from a hasp, rusted but not locked, as if the last person with authority had decided even security was more trouble than the building was worth. Sienna removed the deed envelope and held it in one hand while lifting the latch with the other. The door stuck. She pressed her shoulder gently against it. Nothing. She set down the satchel, placed both hands flat, and pushed with her weight. Somewhere inside, swollen wood resisted, then gave with a long scrape that travelled up through her arms. The door opened 6 inches, then a foot. Cold air moved out, carrying a smell so sudden and layered that Sienna closed her eyes. Old wax, cedar, mildew, ash, mouse nest, rain in wood. Beneath all of it, faint but unmistakable, honey. Not the clean sweetness of a jar, not clover or basswood named on a label. This was aged honey, darkened by time, trapped in comb, spilled into grain, warmed once by summers long gone and cooled again through winters that had entered by every crack. It was sweetness after abandonment, sweetness that had not known it was supposed to disappear. She picked up the satchel and stepped inside. The front room held the last grey light of afternoon. Dust lay on everything, not evenly, but in drifts where the roof had leaked and dried. Along the left wall stood a counter made from 2 planks set over trestles. Above it, wooden shelves sagged under empty jars, most filmed with grime, some still carrying paper labels browned at the edges. A scale sat near the centre of the counter, its round face cloudy but intact. Against the right wall were stacked hive boxes, some sound, some split, all smelling faintly of cedar and bees. The floor was white pine, wide-planked, cupped with age, and soft near the door. Sienna tested each step before giving it weight. Her shoes left dark marks where mud met dust. On the far wall, 3 hooks held a veil torn away from its hat. A pair of leather gloves stiffened into claws, and an uncapping knife with a bone handle cracked down the middle. In the corner stood a small cast-iron stove, round-bellied and black, its pipe rising into the fieldstone chimney. Someone had left the stove door open. Inside lay grey ash, mouse droppings, and 1 curl of birch bark that had never burned. A metal kettle sat on top, its lid missing. Sienna touched the stove. It was as cold as riverstone. The back room was lower by 1 step. She stood at the threshold until her eyes adjusted. This was the workroom, larger, darker. The ceiling beams were exposed, cedar and oak, smoke-stained above the place where a rendering kettle must once have stood. A long extraction table ran beneath the rear windows. Beside it were buckets, strainers, a wax press, wooden frames tied in bundles, and 3 rusted drums set on iron legs. In the centre of the room stood the honey extractor. It was taller than her waist, made of cast iron and galvanized metal, with a crank handle on one side and a domed lid split into 2 halves. Its legs were bolted to a wooden platform, and its body had dark streaks down the side where honey had once escaped and hardened and gathered dust until it looked almost like varnish. The crank hung still. The basket inside did not move. Even in neglect, the machine held a certain authority, the way tools do when built by hands that expected them to outlast grief. Sienna did not touch it yet. She moved instead through the rooms, noting danger. Broken glass beneath the rear window, a soft place near the stove, a raccoon track in dried mud by the threshold, a gap in the roof where she could see a grey piece of sky. The air grew colder as evening entered. Somewhere overhead, water dripped once, though no rain was falling. She found a broom behind the front door with half its bristles gone, and swept a section of floor near the stove. Dust rose and made her cough. In a cupboard below the counter, she found newspapers from the 1980s, a rusted tin of nails, 2 candles gnawed by mice, and a jar containing 6 wooden matches with green heads. She struck one on the stove, it broke. She struck a second. It flared, sulphur-sharp in the cold air, then steadied. The candles were poor, but they took flame. Their light did not fill the room. It simply gave the dark edges. Sienna pulled the door closed as far as it would go and wedged it with a hive box she found burlap sacks in the back room, shook them outside until the dust made her eyes water, and spread the cleanest 2 near the stove. She did not dare light a fire, not yet. The chimney might be blocked. The pipe might leak smoke into the room. The floor beneath the stove might be less sound than it looked. Ruth would have said warmth earned by carelessness had a way of charging interest. So she kept her coatless body warm by moving. She carried broken glass into a corner. She stacked sound hive boxes against the front wall to block a draft. She placed the county envelope inside the satchel, then tucked the satchel beneath the counter where dripping could not reach it. She found an old bee veil and laid it over the broken window like a poor curtain. The work did little. It gave her hands a reason to continue. When darkness settled, it did not arrive suddenly. It thickened in the back room first, then under the shelves, then inside the open stove, then around the extractor until the machine became only a shape with a handle. The candle flames lowered and straightened. Outside, the creek kept speaking in the marsh. Once something small moved in the wall and went still when she turned her head. Her stomach cramped. She had not eaten since the sandwich. She took the jar of sugared honey from the satchel and opened it with difficulty, gripping the lid through the towel wrapped around the knife. The smell rose slowly, crystallized and faint. She scraped out a spoonful with the back of the paring knife and let it dissolve on her tongue. It was grainy, floral, too sweet at first, then rounded by age into something almost bitter. She ate 3 knife-tip portions and stopped. The jar had to last. For bedding, she used the burlap sacks, the extra shirt folded under her head, and the canvas satchel pressed against her chest. The floor was hard. Cold came through it in steady waves. She lay facing the stove, watching candlelight tremble on the iron. Above her, the roof answered the night with small ticks and settles. Old buildings speak most when people stop moving. They say what they have endured in joints, nails, boards, drafts, and drips. This one had a long vocabulary. Sienna listened. She did not feel rescued. That would have been too simple, and the world had not been simple with her. She felt the ache of walking. She felt hunger, cold, the bruised strap mark on her shoulder, the sting of cracked lips, the weight of signatures she had given before, and the strangeness of the one she had given that morning. She felt the nearness of a roof that might fail, a county deadline, a clerk's caution, and a dead woman's surname travelling through paper into her hands. Near midnight, wind moved through the broken west window and crossed the room. The candle nearest the stove went out. The second guttered, recovered, and burned low. In the dimness, the extractor in the back room gave a single soft sound, metal shrinking in the cold or settling after years of being left alone. Sienna opened her eyes. The room held still. She waited. Nothing followed. No footstep, no voice, no demand entering from the road. Only the creek, the wind, the old cedar boards easing themselves around the night. She pulled the burlap higher and breathed through the edge of the satchel, where Ruth's canvas still carried, beneath all grime and travel, the faintest kept memory of smoke. The house had been waiting longer than she had been running. By morning, the water in the kettle had frozen into a shallow grey lens. Sienna woke before the light reached the windows, not because she had slept enough, but because cold had entered her bones and begun counting them. Her shoulder ached from the floor. Her knees were stiff. One cheek bore the weave of burlap. For several minutes she remained still and listened to the building decide whether to admit the day. The roof clicked. A mouse moved inside the front wall. Outside, some winter bird gave one thin note from the walnut trees, then fell silent. She sat up slowly and watched her breath pale the air. The first task was not restoration. It was permission from the place itself. She folded the burlap sacks and set them on the counter. She took the county envelope from the satchel, checked that the deed was dry, and tucked it behind 3 empty jars on the highest shelf. Then she began to walk the floor, one board at a time, learning which planks held, which flexed, which answered with a hollow note that meant trouble underneath. Near the front door, the pine gave under her heel and rose after she stepped away. She marked that place with a broken strip of cedar. Beside the stove, 2 boards were dark where old water had come down the chimney. They felt soft at the edges, but not gone through. In the back room, the floor around the extractor was stronger, crossed below by joists she could see through a gap near the wall. She learned the house by pressure. There was no working pump on the property. Behind the rear addition, under sumac and burdock, she found the old wellhead covered by a warped plank weighted with field stones. The boards around it were slick with moss. When she lifted one stone, a black beetle ran across the plank and vanished. The well opening beneath was lined with stone narrow and deep. She dropped a pebble and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. A faint sound returned, not splash exactly, but contact with something below. No rope. No bucket. No safe cover. She put the plank back, placed the stones, and tied a rag from her spare shirt on a sumac branch as warning to herself in the dark. The outhouse stood farther back, leaning toward the marsh with the resignation of a man tired of standing. Its door hung by one hinge. Goldenrod had grown through the floorboards, dry stems brushing the seat. Sienna opened the door with the end of a fallen branch and waited for whatever lived inside to leave. Nothing did. The pit was unusable, the floor uncertain, the roof half gone. Behind it she found a patch of level ground screened by brush. She marked a temporary place with stones, ashamed and practical at once, then turned back toward the house without letting the feeling speak. Practicality was kinder than shame. That day she did not go into town, she swept, sorted, and carried. She cleared the front counter of mouse nests made from newspaper and old wax paper. She moved broken glass into a galvanized bucket. She opened shelves and then closed them when the smell of mildew rose too strongly. At noon, she walked to the farm market pump and filled the kettle, then drank until her stomach hurt. On the way back, she picked 2 windfall apples from the grass, cut away the brown parts with a paring knife, and ate what the frost had spared. By dusk, she knew 7 floor sounds. The thin squeak near the counter meant a nail had lifted. The low complaint near the threshold meant water damage. The dry knock in the workroom meant solid wood over an empty crawl space. The double creak beside the extractor meant 2 boards rubbing at their tongues. The stove corner made almost no sound, which worried her more than noise would have. Silence in a floor could mean strength. It could also mean rot too far gone to answer. On the second day, she found the back wall more open to weather than it had looked. A strip of cedar siding had pulled loose near the sill, leaving a gap wide enough for a hand. She packed it temporarily with folded burlap and wedged a hive box against it from inside. She took the old bee veil from the broken window, shook off the dust, and tied it more carefully across the missing glass. Its mesh filtered the wind into a fine cold breath. In the afternoon she opened every hive body stacked along the front wall. Some were too far split to save, some needed only scraping, sanding, and new nails. One deep box still held 10 frames. The comb had gone black and brittle, beautiful in a sorrowful way, like lace cut from smoke. She lifted one frame and it broke in her hand, raining dry wax into the box. The smell rose, concentrated and old, a sweetness buried under dust and mouse and time. She took it outside and set it under the walnut tree. Not trash yet. Nothing was trash until she understood what it had been. On the 3rd day, hunger made thought shorter. She walked to the pump at first light, then followed the road farther than before, past the farm market, past a mailbox shaped like a barn, past an orchard where workers in orange hats were pruning with saws that whined in the cold morning. After nearly 2 miles, she came to the first open business she had seen since leaving town. A hardware store sat at the crossing of Grey Road and a smaller north-south route. its sign painted on corrugated metal. K-Line Hardware and Farm Supply, Tool Seed Feed Stovepipe Glass. The building was long and low, with a gravel lot full of salt bags, split wood, propane tanks, and 2 wheelbarrows chained together. A bell rang when Sienna opened the door. Warmth met her with the smells of oiled metal, sawdust, coffee, rubber boots, and stove blacking. For a moment she stood just inside, blinking at the abundance. There were aisles of nails in brown bins labelled by hand, shelves of hinges, hasps, wire, rope, lamp oil, mason jars, cork, screws, copper fittings, paintbrushes, seed packets, mousetraps, pipe collars, work gloves, and storm window kits. Along the back wall, stovepipe hung from rafters like dull black organ pipes. A pot-bellied stove near the counter gave off an even heat. Beside it, an old golden retriever slept on a flattened feed sack, one eyebrow lifting when the bell stopped trembling. The man behind the counter was tall but stooped, with a red plaid shirt under canvas overalls and a white beard trimmed close to the chin. His hands were broad, the nails square, the knuckles nicked and scarred by old work. He wore a hearing aid in his left ear and a pencil tucked behind the right. When he looked at Sienna, he did not smile immediately. He looked first at her shoes, then her satchel, then her face, and then, to her surprise, toward the road behind her through the glass door. "You are the one at the honey house," he said. Sienna tightened her grip on the satchel strap. "Yes." Word travels fast when nobody says much. "Yes." He wiped his hands on a cloth, though they were already clean. "Name is Alden Klein. Sienna Voss." At the name, the old dog lifted its head all the way. Alden Klein drew the pencil from behind his ear and tapped it once on the counter. Voss. That explains why Miriam called. Sienna felt the room tilt toward uncertainty. "The clerk called you?" She asked whether my pump still worked. I told her it did, if a person had patience and did not mind rust the first 10 strokes. He glanced toward the back shelves. She also asked whether I still kept repair manuals. I told her I keep everything because throwing things away is for people with children who answer the phone. The sentence had no bitterness in it. Only weather. "I do not have much money," Sienna said. "No one buying a condemned honey house has much money. I'm not asking for charity." "I did not hear you ask." They stood across the counter from one another while the stove made a small settling sound. Alden leaned down, opened a cabinet, and brought out a thick paper book with a torn green cover. Home and Farm Structure Repair, 1972 edition. The pages had softened from use. Blue pencil marked the corners. "This is outdated in places," he said. "Electric, plumbing, roof load tables, anything involving permits. You check elsewhere. But wood, water, mortar, glass, chimney draft, rot, and keeping yourself alive around a questionable structure. It is still better than most new books with glossy pictures." He set it on the counter. "I cannot buy that. I did not offer to sell it." Sienna looked at the book, then at him. "I do not know when I can bring it back." "Bring it back when the building stops trying to kill you." She did not know what to do with that sentence, so she placed both hands on the counter and held them still. "Thank you." Alden nodded once, as if thanks were a receipt he did not need but would not refuse. "You will need a credit account." "I cannot." "You can have one." "I do not have collateral. Neither does a calf in April. But a farmer still feeds it if he wants milk later. I might fail. Most people do. At first. I might not be able to pay for months. Then I will write small numbers in a book and wait." Sienna shook her head. Careful and slow. "Sir, I have had men put papers in front of me before. I need to know what I'm signing." Alden's expression changed then, not softening exactly, but becoming more exact. He reached below the counter and lifted an old ledger bound in black cloth. He opened it to a blank page and turned it toward her. Lines ruled in blue. Columns marked date. ITM, debit, credit, balance. "No interest," he said. "No fees. No signature. You look at the page every time. I write what you take. You pay when you can. If you cannot, you tell me before shame starts doing your talking." The old dog sighed and set its head back down. Sienna read the blank page as if fine print might rise from it. None did. "I can pay a little now," she said. "How much?" She counted coins on the counter, leaving $5 hidden in the satchel because a person had to keep enough to flee even from kindness. $1.19. Alden looked at the coins. "That will buy a box of matches and 3 nails if we are being foolish. Let us not be foolish." He turned the ledger toward himself and wrote her name at the top of the page in block letters. Then he began listing the items he believed she needed first, asking questions between each line. "Roof leaking into chimney wall?" "Yes." "Stovepipe sound?" "I do not know. Do not light it yet." "Chimney first." "You have daylight through roof." "3 places. Mark them from inside." "Do not climb until you know rafters." "Windows." 3 gone. 4 cracked. 1 good. Cover gone ones before weather shifts. He moved through the store with a shallow cardboard box balanced on one forearm, choosing not what would restore the building, but what would keep it from worsening while she learned. 6mm plastic sheeting, 9 by 12, $1.89. A small roll of tar paper, leftover end, $2. Galvanized roofing nails, 1 pound, $2.40. Mason's line, 50 feet, 79 cents. A utility knife with a retractable blade, used no charge written. Work gloves with patched palms, $1. A wire chimney brush, 6-inch, $4.50. 2 lengths of fiberglass rod, $3 total. A flat pry bar, used $1.50. A hand broom, 85 cents. Dust masks, 2 for 50 cents. Box of wooden matches, 39 cents. 3 cans of beans, dented. 60 cents each, from a shelf by the stove that seemed not entirely part of the store. He wrote each price in the ledger. The numbers made Sienna's stomach tighten, but their exactness helped. Debt named plainly was different from debt hidden in another person's drawer. The total stood at $20.21. Alden looked at it, then crossed out the beans and wrote house account beside them. "I need to pay for food too," Sienna said. "You will." Later. "No." He capped the pen. "Miss Voss, you can argue with me after you have eaten something hot." The words were firm but not ownership. He was not asking to be obeyed for his pride. He was asking a practical woman to accept the order of needs. Heat before apology. Food before accounting. Life before balance. She carried the box back along Grey Road against her hip, stopping twice to rest. The repair manual rode under her arm inside the satchel, heavy as a brick. By the time she reached the honey house, the afternoon had lowered and the windows reflected the colourless sky. She set the box inside the front room and worked until dark, tacking plastic over the broken windows with old strips of cedar, roofing nails, and the borrowed courage of instructions written by people who assumed a reader might survive if told the truth. The plastic cracked in the wind but held. The next morning she began the chimney. She read the chapter 3 times before touching a tool. First inspection from below, then from the clean-out if present, then from the roof only after confirming ladder, footing, and structure. She had no ladder safe enough to use and no knowledge of the roof, so she began from inside. The stovepipe came apart only after 2 hours of persuasion. She set a bucket beneath the elbow, wrapped her face with a damp scrap of cloth under a dust mask, and eased the first joint loose. Creosote fell like black cornflakes, glossy, sharp-smelling, and dry enough to frighten her. Ruth's lessons had been about smoke as request. This was smoke after years of forgetting its manners. Sienna laid plastic under the stovepipe and brushed downward first, turning the wire head slowly through the thimble into the chimney throat. The rod flexed. The brush caught. She drew it back, cleared the bristles, and tried again. Soot dust gathered on her wrists and under her nails. Every few passes, she stopped to let the air settle. The manual warned against breathing creosote. It warned against assuming an open flue because a little light showed. It warned against fires in chimneys that had spent years collecting what a flame could turn violent. She listened to warnings now. She had learned the cost of ignoring the quiet ones. For 5 hours she worked the brush upward as far as the rods allowed, turning, lifting, lowering, scraping. She opened the stove door and removed ash with a flattened tin can, placing it in the galvanized bucket. Beneath the ash she found 2 mouse nests, 1 acorn, 3 dead beetles, and a screw too long for the stove. The fire brick lining was cracked but present. The grate had rusted thin at one edge. The damper moved only after she oiled it with a little cooking grease from an old jar left on the shelf and worked it back and forth for 20 minutes. At sunset, she was black from forehead to wrists. The next day, she walked to Klein's with the stovepipe measurements written on a strip of newspaper. Alden sold her a used elbow and a collar dented on one side, then showed her how to crimp the pipe with pliers so the male end pointed down, keeping creosote inside the pipe rather than leaking out at the seams. "Smoke rises," he said, tapping the pipe. "Creosote runs down. Build for both." She repeated it once, not because she had forgotten, but because exact words helped fix exact dangers. Back at the honey house, she fitted the pipe, sealed gaps with furnace cement. Alden had scraped into a baby food jar and waited until the next morning because the label said cure before firing. She spent the waiting hours clearing the stove corner, cutting away punky scraps, laying a sheet of salvaged metal under the front feet and testing the floor again. It gave no worse answer than before. At first light on the 6th morning, she built the first fire. Not logs, not haste. A thumb of birch bark, 3 curls of cedar shaving, pencil-thin twigs gathered dry from beneath the eaves. 1 match, the flame caught blue at the match head, yellow at the shaving, then moved into the kindling with a delicate appetite. Sienna crouched before the open stove door and watched the smoke hesitate, gather and lift into the pipe. No leak showed. She added 2 more twigs. Then a split of applewood no longer than her hand. The stove clicked as iron began to warm. A smell rose from it, not pleasant at first. All dust, rust, and old soot waking under heat. She opened the front door an inch and waited with wet cloth ready, in case smoke rolled back. It did not. The draft strengthened, the flame steadied, the cold in the room withdrew by degrees, not defeated, only moved back from the center. Sienna sat on the floor and held her hands toward the stove. After a while she set the dented kettle on top with water from the pump. It took a long time to heat. When steam finally lifted from the spout, she opened one of Alden's cans of beans with the paring knife, bent the lid back, and warmed the can in a pan of water. The smell filled the front room slowly. Tomato, salt, metal, and ordinary human comfort. She ate with a clean hive tool because she had no spoon. The first hot meal did not heal anything. It did not make her brave in a large way. It simply entered her body and told each cold place that another hour was possible. After food came inventory. She devoted the 7th day to the workroom because the machine in the center had become impossible to ignore. She did not begin with it. She began at the doorway and moved clockwise, making lists on paper torn from the back of the repair manual where blank pages remained. Left wall. 21 shallow frames, 7 cracked, 9 usable after scraping, 5 uncertain, 3 deep frames with wax moth damage, 2 hive bodies beyond repair, 4 bottom boards, 1 sound, 6 inner covers warped, 1 smoker without bellows, 1 smoker with torn leather but intact firebox, 2 hive tools, 1 sharp, 1 bent, a box of queen excluder fragments, a burlap sack full of pine shavings, 5 glass jars intact, 12 broken, 1 metal sieve, rust at rim, 1 double sieve frame with cloth rotted away, rear wall, extraction table maple top stained, left leg loose, 2 uncapping tubs galvanized, pinholes in 1 wax press, screw frozen, 3 buckets, 1 with spigot, gasket hardened, 1 enamel basin chipped to black at the edge, a rack for cooling wax molds, 4 molds shaped like 1-pound bars, 6 candle molds, tin, usable if cleaned, One ledger shelf empty. Mouse damage everywhere. Right wall, cedar strips for frame repair, bundled with twine, a handsaw missing 2 teeth, a brace and 3 bits, a draw knife in a leather sheath stiff with age, a wooden mallet split at the head, a jar of rosehead nails, 2 coils of cotton wick, 4 bricks of dark wax wrapped in brittle paper, 1 crate marked Com Honey Supers, empty except for dust and a wasp nest long abandoned. Center Extractor. She stood before it with the list in one hand, up close. The machine was both simpler and stranger than it had seemed in candlelight. The crank entered a gear, housing bolted to the side. The domed lid opened in 2 half-moon leaves. Inside, a wire basket was built to hold frames upright, 4 at a time, so honey could be thrown by centrifugal force against the drum walls and run down through a spigot at the bottom. The handle was wood, darkened where palms had turned it year after year. A small manufacturer plate remained under the gear housing, green paint chipped but letters readable. Root Manufacturing CO. Medina. OHIO. The machine had been made to spin sweetness from comb without destroying what bees had built. That seemed to Sienna a mercy of design. Extraction by patience, not ruin. She tested the crank. It did not move. She did not force it. Instead, she placed both hands on the rim and leaned slightly, feeling the machine's weight. It should have shifted a little on the platform. It did not. She checked the bolts at the legs. 2 were rusted, 1 missing, 1 newer than the others. The wooden platform beneath it sounded solid when tapped. She took the mallet and knocked gently along the drum. Most of the sound was dull. As expected, the note of metal backed by air and wire, but near the lower rear curve, just above the spigot, the sound changed. It became shorter, deeper, not full exactly, but answered. She tapped again. Dull, 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 then that careful. Hidden note. Sienna set down the mallet and looked at the drum. Years of grime and honey streaks obscured the seams. She wiped the area with a damp cloth, then with the edge of burlap. Under the dirt was a circular outline no larger than a dinner plate, not a factory seam, too low for the basket assembly, too precise for damage. Around its edge, wax had been rubbed into the joint and darkened until it matched the metal. Her heart did not race. That would be a lie, told by people who have never found danger disguised as possibility. Her body became very quiet. She crouched and examined the lower curve. At the center of the circle was a disc of cedar, stained almost black, fitted flush into the metal as if the drum had grown around it. A slotted brass screw held it, but the screw head had been packed with wax. She scraped it with the paring knife. The wax came away in brown curls. Beneath, the brass showed dull and greenish. She found the brace and the smallest bit. The screw would not move. She tried again with the flat pry bar as driver, and nearly stripped it. She stopped, went outside, breathed air that smelled of marsh and walnut leaves, came back, heated the tip of the pry bar over a candle flame, and held it against the screw to soften the wax hidden deeper. Then she tried again, pressing inward with all the patience she owned. The screw gave. A quarter turn. Then another. Then enough to remove by hand. The cedar disc did not fall free. She eased the paring knife around the edge, careful not to split it. A line opened. The disc released with a small dry sound, like a jar unsealing after years in a cellar. Behind it was darkness, no larger than a man's forearm. She brought a candle close, but not too close. The compartment inside had been built into the lower hollow outside the spinning basket, a place hidden by the curve of the drum and the old platform. It smelled of cedar, metal, and paper held away from weather. Something cloth-wrapped rested within. Sienna sat back on her heels. The workroom had grown very still. She did not reach in immediately. It seemed wrong to snatch from a place that had kept its silence longer than anyone alive. She cleaned her hands in cold water. She spread burlap on the floor. She set the candle on the extraction table away from loose paper. Then she returned to the opening and drew out the first package with both hands. It was wrapped in oilcloth tied with linen string. The cloth had stiffened but not rotted. On the outside, in faded pencil, someone had written, "For the hands that come after." Sienna placed it on the burlap. The second package was smaller, wrapped in brown paper and tied with blue thread. It was heavy for its size. The third was a tin box, rectangular, painted black, its corners worn bright. The fourth was a roll of paper inside a waxed sleeve. The fifth, wedged deeper, required the hooked end of the hive tool. It came free reluctantly, a cotton pouch that gave off a soft metallic clink when set down. Then the compartment was empty except for cedar shavings and one dead moth. Sienna sat on the floor with the packages arranged before her in the order they had come out. Light from the front room reached the back in a grey band. The candle made the tin box shine along one edge. Outside, the creek moved under ice. Speaking in the same steady voice it had used all week, she opened the oilcloth first. Inside lay tools, each wrapped separately in cloth, a grafting knife with a curved blade, a tiny queen marking cage made of wood and screen, a hive tool thinner and finer than the two on the wall, a brass bee brush with horsehair bristles gone soft but not brittle, and a small carpenter's square, no bigger than her palm. There was also a pair of calipers, handmade with measurements marked not only in inches but in bee space. 3/8 noted with a carved line darkened by handling. Each tool had been cleaned before hiding, oiled, prepared for a future that had not arrived on time. The brown paper held raw material, beeswax cakes wrapped in cheesecloth, darker than any she had seen, smelling of buckwheat, smoke and age. Small envelopes of seed labelled sweet clover, borage, anise hyssop, motherwort, 1969, a spool of cotton wick, a packet of copper eyelets for frame wire, a bundle of cedar corner blocks cut and sanded, each one exact. Under them lay a folded sheet listing hive dimensions in careful pencil, with notes on winter ventilation, mite-resistant stock, and feral swarms found in hollow trees after hard winters. The tin box came next. The latch had rusted but opened under gentle pressure. Inside was money but not loose. Bundles of bills lay wrapped in waxed paper, each tied with string and labelled by year. 1964, 1967, 1971, 1973, 1976. Some were 10s, some 20s. Many 5s and 1s, worn soft, their faces belonging to older designs. Beneath the bills were coin rolls, paper brittle but intact. Wheat pennies, Mercury dimes, Roosevelt dimes, Washington quarters, 3 silver $half wrapped in cloth. At the bottom, in a smaller envelope, were loose coins with notes. 1909 penny, first good swarm year, 1916 dime, Clara's egg money, 1943 steel cent, war year, 1964 half, last silver put by. Sienna did not count quickly. She went to the front room, brought the scale down from the shelf, wiped a place on the counter, and carried the tin box there. She counted in stacks of 10, then recounted, then wrote the numbers on the back of a feed label. Bills first, coins next, rolls by denomination, loose coins separate. She made mistakes and began again. Hunger sharpened and then dulled. Afternoon became evening. She lit both poor candles and kept counting. When she finished, the total came to $33,047. She wrote it once. Then she covered the number with her hand. The room did not change. The roof still leaked in 3 places. The floor still warned her where to step. The plastic still snapped over the broken windows. Her stomach still wanted food. Her fingers remained black at the nails from chimney soot. A sum that could have been a life in one place was in this place, a responsibility so large she could not lift it all at once. In the cotton pouch she found the military medal. It was tarnished, but protected by a square of flannel. The ribbon had faded to muted stripes, and the metal bore the profile of a soldier. Pinned to the cloth was a note in the same careful hand as the packages. Samuel Voss, 1918, Argonne, returned it to family by War Department, 1919. Keep until properly honoured. Sienna held the medal in her palm without closing her fingers over it. Some objects ask not to be owned. They ask to be carried correctly. The roll of paper in the wax sleeve was a map. Not a road map, though. Roads were there in faint ink. It showed orchards, creek beds, abandoned farmsteads, ridges, marsh edges, and old timber lots from Benzie into Grand Traverse, and north toward Leelanau. Red circles marked hollow bee trees and feral colonies. Beside each were notes in a tight hand. Black Locust Ridge, survived winter 1962. No foul brood. Gentle. Swarm casts early June. Hollow beech near Old School Road. Dark bees, strong propolis, do not cut. Apple Hollow behind Bowers Place, Queen Line steady 5 years. Cedar Swamp Colony, bitter honey, disease clean. At the bottom, written more firmly, was a sentence underlined twice. These wild colonies endured what ours could not. Learn from them before you breed anything of your own. Sienna read the note standing, then sitting, then with the map spread across the extraction table and weighted at the corners by a hive tool, a wax cake, the empty tin lid, and the small carpenter's square. Coordinates had been added later in blue ink, probably from a survey map or a county plat. Some sites might be gone, trees fall, orchards are cut, roads widen, land changes hands, yet the care of the record remained. Someone had watched bees not as profit, not as hobby, but as kin to be studied with humility. Beneath the map sleeve, almost hidden in the roll, was a sealed envelope. It was thick cream paper, yellowed at the edges, addressed in dark ink not to a name but to a circumstance. To the one who finds the house still standing. Sienna did not open it. The decision arrived before curiosity could argue. The day had already given more than her body could hold. Money tools, seeds, a medal, a map of living lines hidden in the woods, an envelope with a voice waiting inside it. She knew the danger of taking too much from a room at once. Even gifts could flood a person. Even mercy could require strength to receive. She placed the bills back into their waxed bundles. She wrapped the coins. She returned the medal to its flannel but kept it outside the pouch. She folded the map along its existing creases and slid it into the sleeve. She set the sealed envelope on top of the tin box and laid both beneath the counter behind the scale, where no drip could reach. Then she went outside. Night had come clear and cold. The clouds had moved off, leaving stars scattered hard over the orchard country. Frost silvered the grass. The walnut branches stood black against the sky, each twig exact as ink. From the marsh the creek spoke louder than usual, freed in places from ice by its own moving. She walked toward it slowly, careful over frozen ruts and fallen branches, until the honey house was behind her and only its roofline showed between the trees. At the edge of the water, she crouched and rested her hands on her knees. The creek was narrow, no more than 6 feet across, running over stones under a thin skin of shore ice. It carried leaves, a feather, a strip of bark, and the reflected light of stars broken into small pieces. Sienna watched the water pass beneath the ice and thought of bees in hollow trees, living through winters without anyone naming them productive, valuable, managed, or improved. They had endured by methods no county notice could record. They had clustered, eaten what they had stored, sealed cracks with propolis, waited out cold by becoming one body around their own heat. Behind her, the honey house stood dark. Inside it, a sealed envelope waited unopened. The money waited. The map waited. The tools waited in their cloth. Nothing called her back with urgency. The world, for once, did not demand that she decide everything before morning. She remained by the creek until her feet numbed. Then she returned to the house, shut the door against the wind, placed the medal on the counter beside the cold stove, and lay down on the burlap with her hands folded under her cheek. The house had been waiting longer than she had been running. Morning entered through the plastic-covered windows as a dull white trembling. Sienna rose with soot still under her nails and the taste of cold iron in her mouth. For a while she did only necessary things. She brought water from the pump behind the closed farm market. She broke the skim of ice in the kettle. She fed a careful handful of twigs to the stove and waited for the draught to prove itself clean. She warmed the last of the beans in the can, then set the empty tin aside because nothing with a useful shape was nothing anymore. Only after the room had gathered a little heat did she take the sealed envelope from beneath the counter. The paper was heavier than anything in the room except the medal. Its edges had browned evenly. The flap was sealed with dark wax pressed by a thumb, not a signet. On the front, the handwriting leaned slightly right. Letters tall and narrow, the capitals plain, the spaces measured with an old schoolroom discipline. She knew it before she admitted she knew it. Not Ruth's handwriting. Ruth wrote wider, with blunt T's and practical loops. This hand belonged to someone earlier, but the family resemblance was there, in the same patient pressure, the same refusal to hurry a line. Sienna had seen it in the margins of old hive notes, in the way careful women mark dates so the future would not have to guess. She sat at the extraction table, placed the medal above the envelope, and slid the paring knife under the flap. The wax gave with a dry click. Inside were 8 folded pages, creased once down the center and once across, written on both sides in ink faded to brown. The first page held its own faint smell, paper, cedar, beeswax, and something medicinal, as if it had once lived in a sick-room drawer. Sienna smoothed it with both hands, keeping the original creases. Then she began to read. "My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has come to your hands, then the house has stood longer than reason promised, and the cedar has kept better faith than people did. I do not know your name. I do not know whether you are kin by blood, by labor, by mercy, or by accident. I only know that no idle person will have found this hiding place. The extractor does not yield to curiosity alone. It asks for patience, and so I will trust that you have some. My name is Sienna Mae Voss. I'm writing from a bed in Munson Hospital in Traverse City, under the care of Dr. Harold M. Whitcomb, who has told me plainly what my own body has been telling me since September. The sickness is in the blood and bones. He has given it a name I will not spend ink repeating more than once. Leukemia. I have made my peace with the word, though not with the disorder it has brought to my shelves. A woman may be ready to die and still be offended by leaving jars unlabeled. The house began before me. My great-grandfather, Abel Voss, born 1841 near Utrecht in the Netherlands, came through New York as a boy and settled first in Allegan County, where he kept bees in straw skeps and learned American winters by losing nearly everything. His daughter, Clara Voss de Witt, born 1868 near Holland, Michigan, married into Cherryland north of the bay and brought with her a queen line dark as coffee and gentle in the hand. Her son, Samuel Abel Voss, born 1894 outside Cedar, built the first proper hive boxes used by this family and fought in France before he had earned the right to grow old. His sister, my mother, Miriam Clara Voss, born 1898 in Leelanau County, carried the bees when Samuel did not come home whole, and she taught me to hear the difference between a hive that is cross and a hive that is asking for help. I was born in 1917, in a snow year deep enough that my father tied rope from the porch to the barn so no one would lose direction between chores. By then fruit growers had learned what bees did for the orchards, though some still thought honey was the main harvest. This building was raised in 1931 by 4 families and 3 widows, using cedar milled from Windfall north of Maple City and stone pulled from a field that broke 2 plow points every spring. It was never grand. It was not meant to be. It was built to work cleanly, to keep robbing bees from the frames, to warm wax without scorching, to store tools dry, and to give tired hands a room where the smell of honey could remind them why labor ought to be careful. What closed the trade here was not one misfortune, though the county papers will likely make it look that way. The date I mark is October 14th, 1969. That morning we burned 32 hives in the North Yard after American foul brood was confirmed by the state inspector. We had fought it for 2 seasons, cutting, scorching, isolating, praying, and lying to ourselves by turns. I can still see the smoke going up without sweetness in it. Bees do not understand quarantine. Disease does not respect a family name. By noon my brother Andrew had taken an axe to the worst boxes himself, and by dusk the honey house smelled of kerosene, grief, and wet ash. After that, people stopped bringing frames. Some had lost colonies, some were ashamed, some decided bees were too much trouble when sprays, trucking, and purchased pollination could make a man feel modern. The co-op dissolved 1 signature at a time. For more than 30 years, the house stood under its sign with no regular work inside it. I came when I could. I swept. I oiled the extractor. I kept records of the wild colonies that survived in trees and abandoned walls, because the feral bees had manners and strengths our boxed colonies were losing. They endured cold mites before we named them well. Foul weather, neglect, and the ignorance of men with machines. I thought someone ought to write down where the survivors lived. My husband, Daniel Price, served in the United States Navy during the Second World War and came home with lungs that never fully trusted air again. He died in 1959 on a February morning while I was rendering wax in the kitchen. My uncle Samuel, whose medal you have found if the pouch has not rotted, served in the Great War and never returned to himself. The paper says he died in 1919 of complications from wounds. My mother said he died a little each day from the argon until his body caught up. My brother Andrew went to Korea with an engineer battalion and came back with silence packed so deep in him that no tool could pry it loose. He was a fine carpenter. He could set a frame square by eye and be wrong less than an eighth. He left no children. This is how trades end. Not with one door closing, with hands disappearing. If you intend to work bees, begin smaller than your hunger. 2 colonies are enough for a first true year. Face the entrances southeast if wind allows. Raise the stands 16 inches from the ground and tip each hive forward the width of a carpenter's pencil, so rain cannot sit on the bottom board. Do not open brood boxes below 55 degrees unless there is no other mercy. When rendering wax, keep water under the pan and never let the wax rise past 180 degrees. Better 165 and patience than 190 and regret. For candles, clean wax twice through cheesecloth, then once through muslin if you have it. Warm jars before filling or glass will punish haste. For syrup in spring, 1 part sugar to 1 part water by weight. In fall, 2 to 1. Feed only when needed, and never mistake feeding for keeping. A hive must learn the country under its own wings. If you find feral stock still living at the marked places, do not rob them. Watch first. Return 3 times in different weather. Mark flight strength, color, temper, pollen load, and the shape of the brood pattern if you are able to collect a swarm. A wild colony that has endured without your help is not poor because it lacks your equipment. It is a teacher. Treat it as one. Smoke lightly. Move slowly. If bees boil up at once, close the hive and go home. Some doors are not for you that day. The money is not a prize. I put it by in market years, in drought years, in years when honey sold poorly and wax sold well. Some came from jars, some from candles, some from queens, some from orchard men who paid late and in cash because their wives kept the books more honestly than they did. I hid it because relatives had already begun measuring the house in salvage and because banks have their own weather. Use what is necessary to keep the roof over the work, to return tools to use, to pay honest debts owed for honest help, and to keep yourself from desperation. Do not let it make you grand. Money that outlives its saver should become shelter, not noise. Inheritance is misunderstood. People think it is land, furniture, names on paper, silver locked in drawers, or stories told at reunions by the loudest person at the table. I have come to think inheritance is attention. What you notice, you continue. What you continue, you honor. If you are not of my blood, then perhaps you are still of my keeping. If you are of my blood, do not be proud of that alone. Blood is only a red beginning. It does not finish the work. There may be no bees here when you read this. There may be no Voss left who remembers which window was replaced after the storm of 1947, or why the walnut tree behind the house holds a horseshoe in its east fork. Look there when the ground is safe. I put a marker where Andrew used to hang his coat, and beneath it you will find proof that someone once believed this place worth naming. I'm tired now, and the nurse says I must rest my hand. I have set these things away not because I believe the past can be restored exactly. It cannot. The dead do not return because we polish their tools, but a practice can return in humbler form. A room can be cleaned, a roof can be mended, a candle can be poured from wax rendered carefully. A young queen can begin a line no one will live long enough to fully understand. That is enough. Most worthy things begin by being enough. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Sienna Mae Voss Price, November 3, 1976. Sienna did not move after the last line. The stove gave a small tick, and somewhere in the front wall a mouse resumed its private work. Outside, a truck passed on the far road, the sound rising and falling like weather behind trees. The pages lay under Sienna's hands, her fingers spread wide enough to keep the corners flat. She had read every word without stopping, yet the letter seemed not ended but opened, as if the room itself had been waiting for the sentences to be spoken back into it. She read it a second time. Not quickly, not as a person searching for facts. The second reading was slower, a finger following dates, names, instructions, losses, the exact temperature for wax, the warning about wild colonies, the sentence about inheritance that rested in the letter like a nail set cleanly into good wood. When she reached the closing again, she folded the pages along their original creases, not adding one of her own. The paper resisted slightly at first, then remembered where it had been bent. She placed the letter back in the envelope, but did not seal it. Some things, once opened rightly, should not be made inaccessible again. Then she took the medal, the small carpenter's square, and Ruth's canvas satchel, and went out the back door. The morning had sharpened while she read. Frost clung to the dead grass in shaded places, and the marsh beyond the outhouse gave off a pale vapour where the creek ran free. She followed the rear wall, stepping over the downspout, past the old well she had marked with cloth, toward the walnut tree Eleonora had named. It stood behind the house, larger than she had understood from the lane, with a trunk ridged deep enough to hide a child's hand and limbs lifting east over the roof. She circled once before seeing it. A rusted horseshoe had been grown half into the east fork of the tree, held there by bark that had swelled around iron through years of rain, heat and cold. Only the curved outer edge showed plainly. The nail holes were filled with moss. Beneath it, at shoulder height, a flat stone had been set into the ground, nearly covered by leaves. Sienna knelt and cleared it with both hands. There was a mark carved into the stone. Not a name. A bee within a square. The lines were weathered but deliberate. She traced them with 2 fingers. The bee's wings were simple triangles. Its body was 3 shallow cuts. The square around it had one corner left open, as if the insect could leave when it chose. Beside the stone, tucked under a root where soil had washed back, was a narrow strip of brass, nailed to a fragment of cedar. The words had darkened, but when Sienna rubbed them with her sleeve, letters appeared: Andrew's hook, coats, Veals, and storm lantern. So this had been the place where a carpenter brother hung his coat before entering the work. Not a grave, not a shrine, a practical marker, a memory attached to use. Sienna sat back on her heels, her palms were damp with cold dirt. The tree lifted above her, the horseshoe held in its living grip, the branches bare and exact against the brightening sky. From the neighbouring farmhouse a rooster called late. A dog barked once, then stopped. The ordinary morning went on around the discovery with almost severe indifference. That steadied her. She returned inside and searched the shelves until she found the candle moulds listed among the inventory. One held a remnant of wax fused near the bottom, a short, thick stub left from a candle never fully used. It was the colour of old amber and smelled faintly, when warmed between her hands, of smoke and buckwheat. On a scrap of paper stuck to the mould by wax faded pencil read, "Last per 1963. 60 years. Give or take, sealed in a tin cylinder and darkness." She freed the candle slowly by warming the mould near the stove, never close enough to soften it too fast. When it slid loose into her palm, the wick lay curled and dry at the top. She trimmed it with the paring knife, set it upright in an empty jar, cleared the counter, waited until the room was still. The first match failed, the second bent, the third caught. She held the flame to the wick and watched it blacken, hesitate, then take. The candle burned low at first, a blue thread under a gold bead, then opened into a steady flame. Its smell entered the room gently. Beeswax, thyme, a field before she was born. Work done by hands that could not know hers, yet had prepared something that would make light for her in a condemned room. Sienna set Eleonora's letter beside the candle, far enough to be safe, near enough to be warmed by the glow. Then she began to name the people who had formed the bridge to that moment, not aloud at first. Her lips moved without sound. The woman at choir practice in Frankfurt who had returned with a peanut butter sandwich and no questions, the apple grower's wife in honor who had stood in her robe and offered a hayloft with mice but no men, Miriam Holt who had kept the wrinkled dollar separate in her desk as if odd things deserved careful storage, Alden Klein who had written small numbers in a ledger and waited, even the librarian in the green cardigan who had closed the building by rule but had spoken gently enough that Sienna could carry the rule without breaking. None of them had rescued her. That mattered. Rescue, the way people told it, was often too large, too bright, too close to ownership. What they had given her were smaller mercies. A sandwich, a dry loft, a direction, a manual, an account without a trap, a public table where a notice could be read. Each kindness had been modest enough to preserve her dignity, yet exact enough to keep her moving toward the next hour. Sometimes, if you're listening to this late at night, maybe with the house settled around you and the dishes finally done, you may remember a small kindness you once received and nearly forgot. Someone held a door when your hands were full. Someone paid for coffee when your card failed. Someone sat beside you without asking for the whole story. Tell us, if you would like, about that kindness in the comments. Not the grandest one. The small one, the one that arrived quietly and kept you from going under. Sienna did not know there were strangers far away who would one day hear her story through speakers in dark living rooms, beside sleeping dogs, folded laundry, cooling tea and windows gone black with evening. She only knew the room before her, the candle, the letter, the tools, the map, the money that did not feel like permission to escape so much as obligation to stay careful. She placed the medal beside the flame and cleaned it with a dry cloth only enough to remove loose dust. She would not polish away age. She set the small carpenter's square next to it. She opened the map again and looked at the red circles, but did not plan, not yet. Outside wind moved through walnut branches and brushed the plastic at the windows with a sound like a hand smoothing cloth. Toward evening, she wrapped the letter in its envelope and placed it inside Ruth's canvas satchel. She wrapped the medal again in flannel. She put the fine hive tool, the queen cage, the bee brush, and the carpenter's square beside her bedding, not because she feared they would vanish, but because the room seemed to ask that the first night after the reading be kept close. She ate nothing grand. A portion of beans, warmed slowly, 2 knife-tip tastes of sugared honey, water boiled and cooled enough to drink. Then she banked the tiny fire, checked the door wedge, and lowered herself to the burlap with the satchel under her head. The beeswax candle burned in the jar on the counter until the flame shortened and pooled light inside the glass. Shadows of the extractor, the shelves, the stovepipe, and the hanging veil reached across the room and rested there. Sienna lay with the heirlooms beside her, one hand on the folded canvas, her breath slow enough to hear the house around it. For the first time since entering, she slept past the coldest hour. The first snow came on December 6, beginning after midnight and continuing until the county road. The orchard lanes, the broken sign, and the field stone at the back door all carried the same patient white. By morning there were 4 inches on the ground and a little more gathered along the low edge of the honey house roof. Snow made the building look gentler than it was. It softened the bowed wall, hid the ruts, rounded the sag in the rear addition, and laid a clean line over the cedar shakes where the leaks had been entering for years. Sienna did not trust that gentleness. Water was only waiting in another form. She stood outside with Ruth's canvas satchel over her shoulder, collar turned up against the cold, and watched the roof take weight. The repair manual lay open on the counter inside, Chapter 9 folded back under a jar of nails. She had read the roofing section 3 times before breakfast, once aloud, once silently, and once with her finger travelling each line as if the words were boards over a creek. Roof pitch, load path, rafter tails, flashing, underlayment, sistering, drip edge, temporary stabilization, Do not begin at the visible damage, begin where weight travels. That was the first mercy of the manual. It did not flatter a person. It assumed ignorance could be corrected only by exact attention. The honey house roof measured 24 feet across the front and 32 along the side, though neither dimension remained perfectly true. The rear addition added another 12 by 16, lower and worse. Alden Klein made her measure twice, then come back with the numbers written in pencil on a strip of cardboard. He made her sketch the roofline from all 4 sides while standing at the counter near the stove, his old dog sleeping against a sack of chicken feed. "You're not buying hope," he said. "You are buying coverage." Sienna nodded. He set out material on the counter and wrote in the ledger as he spoke. 1 roll of 15-pound felt, partial but dry. 2 bundles of cedar shingles reclaimed from a barn tear-off, hand-sorted, not new but sound. A coffee can of 1 1/4-inch galvanized roofing nails. 6 8-foot 2x6s for sister rafters. Rough pine, straight enough. 14 feet of bent but usable drip edge. 1 tube of roofing cement for places that should have been properly reflashed, but could not yet be. Chalk line, loaned. Hammer, loaned. Roofing hatchet, not loaned. The hatchet was wrapped in an oilcloth rag when Alden brought it out from the back. Its handle was dark hickory, rubbed smooth where a hand had held it for decades. 1 side of the head carried a nail slot. The blade had been sharpened carefully, not aggressively. Alden laid it on the counter with 2 fingers resting on the pole. "This was my Uncle Amon's," he said. "He roofed barns until his knees quit. It has hung in my shed since 1988. I cannot take that. You can use it. That is not the same." "No." He wrote nothing in the ledger for it. Sienna looked at the hatchet, then at Alden's face. "Why?" Alden scratched the beard under his chin and looked toward the stove. "Because he hated waste. Buildings, tools, people. If something still had work in it, she believed it deserved the chance to do it." She carried the hatchet home wrapped in Ruth's canvas, as if 2 dead crafts had agreed to travel together. The skilled elder arrived the next morning at 9, though no one had told Sienna he was coming. She was outside clearing snow from the rear slope with a broom tied to a pole when a narrow green truck eased down the lane and stopped beside the walnut windbreak. A man climbed out slowly, 1 hand on the door, 1 on a cane made from peeled maple. He wore a black watch cap, a brown wool coat, and rubber boots folded at the top. His face was long and deeply lined, the skin around his eyes red from wind. A white scar cut through 1 eyebrow and disappeared beneath the cap. He looked up at the roof without greeting her. "That corner is lying." Sienna lowered the broom. "Sir?" He pointed with the cane toward the east eave. "Looks high because the fascia curled. Rafter behind it is sunk." Alden had sent him, though the man did not say so until later. His name was Walter Beck. He had roofed houses, barns, sheds, churches, coops, ice shanties, and once, he said, the round roof of a roadside fruit stand shaped like a peach, which he considered foolish architecture but honest money. He was 79. He would not climb steep roofs anymore. He would not take pay. He would tell her where not to put her foot. "That is worth pay," Sienna said. He looked at her as if she had missed something plain. "No." "Mr. Beck?" "No." The refusal had no ornament. It sat between them like a stone. The first day they did not repair anything. They cleared snow and studied. Walter made her stand inside while he tapped rafters from below with a broom handle, listening for dry ring and soft thud. He showed her how to read water stains on the underside of boards, how a leak seldom fell where it entered, how a nail rust line could trace years of seepage. He made her mark the bad places in chalk. 3 active leaks, 1 cracked rafter near the chimney shoulder, 2 failing shake fields, rear flashing nearly gone, east drip edge absent, 1 rafter tail at the front corner too soft to trust with a ladder. "Do not put weight where shame tells you to hurry," he said. It was the longest sentence he spoke that day. For 11 days they worked, not every hour, because weather had its own authority, and Walter's knees had earned obedience. Sienna rose before light, heated water, made thin oatmeal from oats. Alden had added to the ledger without comment. Then read the relevant chapter again until the pages began to hold fingerprints of soot and wax. Walter arrived when the road allowed. If snow came, they shoveled. If wind rose, they worked inside, cutting, fitting, measuring, waiting. He taught by correction. Never praise. That nail's proud. Pull it. Line wandered. Snap again. Blade flat. Not like that. Watch your weight. 3 strokes. The 3-stroke nail was his doctrine. Set the nail with 1 short strike, drive with 1 square strike, finish with 1 exact strike, stopping flush, not burying the head until it bruised the shingle. When Sienna bent a nail, he made her pull it. When she drove one proud, he made her pull it. When she overcorrected and sank one too deep, he made her remove the shingle, split it with the hatchet, and start again. Waste teaches, he said once. The sister rafter near the chimney took 2 full days. Inside, they braced the area with a salvaged post and a plank, checking that the floor below could take the temporary load. Walter showed her how to cut the new 2x6 to match the old rafter's angle, how to set it tight alongside the damaged member, how to clamp it before drilling pilot holes, so the wood would not wander under the screw. They used structural screws Alden had insisted upon, not ordinary deck screws, because roof weight did not forgive cheap confidence. Sienna drove them slowly, the brace and bits squealing in the cold, her hands cramped from pressure. On the roof, she moved like someone learning to cross ice by listening. A borrowed extension ladder rested on boards to spread its feet. Walter stood below, one hand on the rail, cane tucked under his arm, eyes sharper than any level, left knee lower. She obeyed. Do not reach. She moved the ladder. Cold shingle breaks. She warmed the next bundle inside near the stove before carrying it out. They laid felt only where the roof had been stripped, lapping each course over the lower by 3 inches, fastening with cap nails where the wind would not lift it before shingles went down. Walter made her snap a chalk line every 5 inches for exposure, the blue line jumping across the grey felt with a clean authority that pleased her more than she expected. The reclaimed shingles had to be sorted by width and soundness. Cracked ones became shims or kindling. Good ones went into courses, joints offset, grain straight, butt ends aligned to the snapped line. The chimney flashing they could not truly replace yet. Walter showed her a temporary repair with roofing cement, bent metal, and stern warnings. This is not finished. Yes? This is a promise to come back. Yes. The work entered her body. Shoulders first, then wrists, then thighs from bracing on the ladder, then the deep muscles along her back that had long held fear and now held material. Balance, weather, decision. At night, she slept hard and woke sore, but it was a different soreness from running. This one had edges she understood. On the 9th day, snow fell again while they worked under a sky the colour of unwashed wool. Walter stood by the ladder and brushed flakes from the felt before they became water. Sienna's fingers lost feeling through the gloves, returned in pain, then settled into numb competence. She finished a course along the rear addition and looked down to see Walter watching the line. He said nothing for so long she thought she had erred. Then he nodded once. It was enough. They completed the urgent roof work on December 17th. Not restored, not pretty, not permanent in the way Pride likes, but the 3 leaks stopped. The chimney shoulder was covered. The east drip edge carried meltwater away instead of into the sill. The sistered rafter took weight without complaint. The honey house looked patched and serious, like a person bandaged after surviving a long neglect. Walter stood in the lane with his cane planted in snow and considered it. Now it can wait for better work, he said. Sienna wanted to thank him in a way that would hold the 11 days. The cold, the instructions, the patience of an old roofer who had refused money and given exactness instead. Nothing large enough came. She only held out the roofing hatchet. Walter looked at it, then shook his head. Keep the edge dry. So she did. January entered without ceremony. hardening the ruts in Honey House Road and turning the marsh reeds brittle enough to sound like paper when wind crossed them. The roof held through the first thaw and freeze, and that gave Sienna permission to look downward into the chimney. The fieldstone stack had leaned no farther, but the bricks inside the firebox had begun telling the truth. Spalling showed along the rear wall where trapped moisture had entered, frozen, expanded, and lifted the face of the brick in thin scales. Mortar had powdered between joints. When she pressed one seam with the blade of the hive tool, sandy grit fell onto the stoveplate. Not much enough. Alden came out to inspect because Sienna had written down the problem too carefully for him to ignore. He arrived with a 5-gallon bucket, a cold chisel, a tuck-pointing tool, a stiff brush, and a sack of hydraulic lime that had sat in his storeroom so long he called it young by comparison to himself. He crouched before the stove, took off one glove, rubbed mortar dust between thumb and finger, and frowned with his whole forehead. "Do not use Portland here," he said. "I read that in the manual." "Good." "Read it again." He wrote the mix on cardboard in block letters. 2 parts clean sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, a half part fire clay for the firebox joints, less for exterior repointing, water slow, peanut butter, not soup, dampen old brick first, pack the joint, do not smear the face, keep it above freezing while curing. If you cannot keep it above freezing, do not do the work that day. How long? For patience or mortar? Both. Alden's beard moved with what might have been the beginning of a smile. 3 weeks? If you do not get proud. 3 weeks meant mornings in the 20s, sometimes lower, with the stove dark more often than lit, because work near firebrick required clean joints. Not comfort. Sienna hung plastic between the front room and back room to keep what little heat she could near the work area. She warmed bricks with a lamp when she could borrow lamp oil. She heated water on the stove before letting the fire go out, then covered the kettle to keep it usable. The first days were removal only. She wore the patched gloves until her fingers needed delicacy, then worked bare-handed for 15 minutes at a time, no longer, because the cold entered the skin and turned each fingertip into an ache with a bright center. She raked out loose mortar with the tuck-pointing tool, brushed joints clean, vacuumed dust with an old hand bellows reversed into a jar contraption Alden invented and laughed at only after it worked. Pieces of brick face came away in shallow flakes. She saved them in a bucket, though she did not know why, perhaps because ruin should be measured before being discarded. Every quarter hour she stopped to warm her hands under her arms. Sometimes the pain returning was worse than the numbness leaving. She learned to flex each finger separately, thumb, forefinger, middle, ring, little. She learned to keep the lime covered so it would not clump with damp. She learned that mortar mixed too wet looked obedient and failed later. She learned that old brick drank water with quiet greed, and if not dampened before repair, it stole moisture from the mix and left the joint weak. The firebox took the longest. She removed failed mortar from the rear wall, sprayed the brick lightly, and packed the new mix with the narrow tool, pressing until resistance came back through her wrist. Alden had told her a good joint felt full before it looked full. He was right. The tool changed sound when the cavity had taken enough, from scratch to tamp. She struck the joints concave with a rounded piece of dowel, then brushed the surface gently after it had begun to firm. At night she covered the work with old towels and kept a candle burning nearby inside a jar, not for romance but for a little stubborn warmth. On the coldest night, when the temperature dropped to 19 degrees, she woke twice to check that the repair had not frozen. The candle had burned low and left wax down the glass like pale tears. The mortar held. She repointed the chimney shoulder inside the front room where stones met brick, then the visible joints above the stove thimble. Outside work had to wait for kinder weather, but she patched what weather had been using as a doorway. The chimney began to look less like a wound and more like a scar being taught to close. There were failures. One batch turned grainy because she added water too quickly. She carried it outside and dumped it near the sumac, angry enough that her hands shook. One joint cracked because the brick had not been damp enough. She dug it out and redid it. One morning she woke to find frost along the inside of the plastic and the towels stiff at the edges. She did not work that day until noon, when sun came through the east window and lifted the room by 3 degrees. Walter stopped once, looked at the chimney, and said, "Mortar is slower than you." Then he left. On January 28th, after the final firebox joints had cured long enough to trust, Sienna built the test fire. She chose dry apple wood, split small, no bark, no damp ends. She opened the damper, warmed the flue with a twist of burning newspaper held near the throat, then set the kindling. Flame took. Smoke rose, the stove clicked, expanded, steadied. She went outside and looked up. The chimney sent smoke cleanly into the late January air, a pale column that lifted above the cedar roof and bent east with the wind. No black roll. No bitter leak under the eaves. No smoke backing through the door. Just a narrow, honest breath from a building that had nearly forgotten how. Sienna stood in the snow until the cold found the cuffs of her jeans. When she went back inside, the front room had begun to warm, and the smell of smoke was no longer old failure. It was work moving upward correctly. The floors waited until the chimney could keep the room above freezing. White pine had been laid in boards wider than Sienna's hand, and long enough that 2 people must have carried each plank in together. Some were 12 inches across, some nearly 14. Their surfaces had cupped and darkened, stained by honey, soot, boot traffic, rain, mouse paths, and years of dust settling where feet no longer wore it away. Hand-cut rosehead nails held them, many still sound, their heads blackened and slightly irregular, each one catching light in its own small way. Alden warned her against making the floor new. "New is not the same as clean," he said. "I only want safe. Good. Safe first. Honest second. Pretty if it happens." He rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, though rented was another word he wrote loosely in the ledger and underlined once. It came in a hard plastic case with 3 sanding discs tucked inside. She bought more paper, 80 grit for the first pass, 120 for the second, 220 for the final smoothing. Alden made her buy a respirator, not a paper mask, and showed her how to fit it. "Old floors hold old things," he said. "Do not breathe history if you can help it." Before sanding, she set every proud nail. Walter's lessons helped. Tap, not pound. Feel the head move below the surface. Stop before the hammer makes a crescent in the pine. She crawled the whole front room on her knees, then the workroom, marking boards too soft to sand. 2 near the door would need replacement later. 1 beside the stove could be patched with a Dutchman repair when she had better wood. The extractor platform she left alone. The first pass frightened her. The sander started with a hard spinning whine that filled the room and travelled up her arms. She held it too tightly at first, leaving a shallow crescent where she paused too long. She stopped, breathed, and began again. Keep moving. Let the paper cut. Do not dig. Work with the grain where possible. Feathering cross marks. The 80 grit lifted the grey first, then the blackened surface, then old stains that had gone deep and would not be erased. She was glad they stayed. By afternoon, dust lay over everything in a fine amber coat. She had hung sheets over the tools and sealed the doorway with plastic. But dust entered anyway, patient as time. She swept between passes, then wiped with damp cloths until her knees ached from bending. The first pass took the room from abandonment to exposure. Every floor showed, every darkened spill, every wear path, every line where a counter had once stood. The second pass with 120 grit changed the sound. Less tearing. More hum. Pine warmed under the sander and released a smell so clear that Sienna stopped once just to stand in it. Not lumberyard pine. Older. Resin and sun held inside boards cut when the trees still remembered a different county. With 220 grit, the surface became touchable, not smooth like factory wood, smooth like a worktable cared for by generations. She ran her palm across a board near the front window and felt shallow waves left by saw marks beneath the sanding, as if the original mill blade had written in a language she was not meant to remove. The colour after cleaning surprised her. Where the boards had looked grey, they became dark honey. Where honey had soaked deep, they became mahogany. Around the stove, heat and soot had made the grain nearly black, not burned through, but marked. The path between the front door and the workroom remained visible even after sanding. a faint river of foot traffic crossing the boards. She left it. A floor that had carried work should be allowed to remember walking. For finish, Alden argued with himself in front of the shelf and finally sent her back with tongue oil blended with a little boiled linseed oil, warning her about rags, combustion, ventilation, curing, and impatience. He repeated the rag warning twice. Lay them flat outside, he said. Do not ball them. Do not stack them. Do not put them near heat. A rag can burn your house down while looking innocent. The first coat drank in so quickly that she wondered if she had done it wrong. She worked on hands and knees with a cloth wrapped around a block, rubbing oil into the pine in thin layers, not flooding. The wood darkened under her hand. Grain rose, old marks deepened. The room changed not by becoming new but by becoming visible. She waited 48 hours. Waiting was work too. She forgot that often. The second coat took less. The third left a low sheen that appeared only when light crossed sideways from the east window. Between coats, she kept the stove low, the door cracked for air, and the oil rags spread on the stone outside beneath a crate so they would not blow away. Every morning she checked them like small dangerous animals. Then came the bad morning. It arrived without reason grand enough to explain it. The roof held, the chimney drafted, the floors had taken finish, the money remained hidden and counted. No one had found her, no paper had come, no voice had entered from the road. Yet on the morning after the third coat cured, Sienna woke and could not make her hands lift the kettle. Her body had moved for weeks because stopping had seemed dangerous. That morning stopping came anyway. She sat on the floor beside the stove, boots unlaced, hair loose. The repair manual open on her knees and unread, light crossed the finished boards and showed every place she had worked. The sight should have steadied her. Instead it made the room feel too large. Every task completed revealing 3 that remained. Windows, plaster, sill, cellar, well, outhouse. These she was not ready for. A map she could barely bear to unfold. A future that required more courage than running had. She closed the manual. Then she stood, put on the sweatshirt, took no tools, and walked to the marsh. The creek had widened under thaw. Ice held along the edges, but the centre ran dark and quick, carrying bits of snowmelt and brown leaves. A great blue heron stood in the shallows near a bend, one leg lifted, head drawn back into its shoulders. The bird looked carved from weather. It did not leave when Sienna approached, though she stopped far enough away to show she understood its claim. For 2 hours she sat on a fallen cedar log and watched it. The heron moved only when movement was required, a step so slow the water barely altered, a neck extending with exact hunger, a beak entering the creek like a needle. Once it caught something silver and small, swallowed, and returned to stillness, as if the act had been neither triumph nor cruelty, only being alive. Sienna did not work that day. By afternoon, clouds thickened and the bird lifted, wings wide and prehistoric, crossing the marsh without hurry. She watched until it disappeared beyond the walnuts. Then she walked back to the honey house, sate beans cold from the can, and slept before dark. The next morning, she rose and washed the cup. That was all the victory she needed. February brought harder light. Snow remained in shaded places, but the sun had begun finding angles under the eaves. The windows could no longer be postponed. Plastic had carried her through December and January, snapping, fogging, loosening at the edges, holding just enough. Now the wind had found every nail hole and every careless fold. The honey house needed glass again, or at least the promise of it. There were 8 windows. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked. Each crack a different map of impact. Freeze saw settling wood. One east window, the oldest, remained whole, its wavy pane bending the walnut branches outside into a watery shimmer. Alden looked at that one and said, "Do not replace it." I was not going to good. He leaned closer, breath fogging faintly near the glass. That may be original to the building, or older and reused. See the waves? Cylinder glass, Maybe. It has earned its place. So the east pane stayed. For the others, Sienna learned sash before glass. She removed each window carefully, labeling top, bottom, left, right with pencil on masking tape. Some sash pins had rusted into place. Some came loose too easily. The cords had broken on 2 windows and frayed nearly through on another. Counterweights thudded inside the pockets when she opened them. Iron shapes hanging like hidden organs within the walls. Alden sold her salvaged glass from storm windows removed during summer jobs. Not perfect. Nothing in the building asked for perfect. He cut the first pane himself while Sienna watched, scoring once with the wheel, steady pressure, oil at the cutter, then snapping the glass over a dowel with a sound sharp enough to make her shoulders rise. 1 score, he said. Do not worry it to death. Back at the honey house, she laid each sash on the extraction table over folded burlap. Old glazing came out in flakes, hard as bone where still attached, soft and black where water had entered. She used the putty knife Alden had dulled slightly for her, easing rather than gouging. Glazier's points came free one by one, tiny triangles of metal that had held glass longer than some marriages held vows. The putty was DAP 33, white-grey, dense and cold, until worked in the hand. Alden told her to knead it until it stopped cracking, roll it into a rope, press it into the rabbet, set the glass gently, then bed it with even pressure, points every 8 inches or so more where the sash had warped. Final bevel with the putty knife held at an angle, clean line, corners mitered by patience rather than decoration. Paint it after skin forms, he said. Not before, not never. She wrote that down. The first pane took nearly 3 hours and looked like a lesson rather than a repair. The bevel wavered, 1 corner sagged. She pulled it out, rolled it again, set it cleaner. The second pane went better. The third taught her that cold putty lies. It feels too stiff, then warms suddenly and takes a fingerprint where a smooth line should be. By the fourth, her hands knew the pressure better than her mind did. The sash cords were another education. 1/4 inch cotton, not nylon, because the old pulleys had been made for a softer line, and because plastic rope sounded wrong against the wood. Alden gave her a roll and a handful of brass screws, then drew the knot on the counter. Figure 8 at the counterweight, feed over pulley, tie to sash groove, test travel before closing pocket. Do not let go of the loose end. A counterweight dropped into the wall could take half a day, and most of a person's good sense to retrieve. Sienna lost one anyway. It fell with a heavy hidden thump down inside the casing, and she stood with the cord end in her hand, eyes closed, while dust drifted from the open pocket. Walter, who had stopped by to return a pry bar he claimed was hers, though it was not, said from the doorway, "That sound teaches." "Yes." "Say worse words after I leave." He left. She retrieved the weight with a bent coat hanger, the hive tool, and 40 minutes of stubbornness, then tied the figure 8 knot so slowly it became a kind of prayer. Through the month the windows returned one by one, 3 with salvaged panes, 4 with cracked panes replaced or stabilized until spring. The original east window cleaned only with vinegar water and a soft cloth, no scraping at the old glass. When the first repaired sash slid in its tracks and stayed open without a stick, Sienna laughed once. The sound startled her. It was small, almost rusty from disuse, and gone before she could be embarrassed by it. Glass changed the rooms more than heat had. The front room gathered morning light and held it on the finished floor. The workroom no longer felt like a shed with walls, but a place with intentions. The extractor stood in a clearer day now, its iron body less ominous, more patient. Dust still came, cold still entered. But the windows gave the honey house its eyes back. The last window was the smallest, set above the rear work table, facing the walnut tree and the marsh beyond. Its sash had swollen so badly that removing it required careful pressure from inside and outside. A little paraffin rubbed along the track, and more restraint than strength. The glass had been gone when Sienna arrived, and the plastic over it had torn twice in storms. She fitted a salvaged pane with a faint green edge, set the points, warmed the putty between her palms, and laid the final bevel in one continuous stroke along the bottom rail. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch. It was a little winter scrap of a bird. Black cap, white cheek, grey back, buff sides barely visible in the hard light. It hopped once, then again, tilting its head toward the window as if inspecting the repair. Sienna held the putty knife still. The bird fluffed itself against the cold, picked at the bark, and remained there while she cleaned the corner with the blade. For a full minute, neither moved quickly. Then the chickadee lifted and crossed toward the sumac, and the window held the branch it had left behind, clear enough to show the small place where its feet had shaken loose a dusting of snow. Late February came with thaw at noon and iron again by sundown. The honey house walls had begun to show what winter had hidden. Once the roof stopped leaking and the windows held, the interior grew dry enough for damage to announce itself in pale dust along the baseboards. The plaster near the chimney had failed in 3 patches, each one a different shape. One was the size of a dinner plate above the stovepipe, one ran long and narrow beside the east corner where water had followed lath for years. A third, the worst, had bellied outward under paint and lime wash until a light touch made it sound hollow. Sienna did not pull it down at once. By then she had learned that old work often looked weaker than it was, and new hands could do more harm than time if they arrived with pride. She tapped around each patch with the handle of the putty knife and marked the loose edges in pencil. Beyond them, the wall answered solidly. Horsehair plaster on hand-split oak lath, original in most places, still held where keys had curled behind the strips and hardened like fingers gripping bone. Alden brought out a paper sack from a shelf so high he needed the step stool. The sack had been folded twice, tied with twine, and marked in his handwriting from decades before. Horsehair, 1950s bag. Keep dry. My father saved it from a plasterer who retired, he said. Never thought I would have reason to sell it by the handful. I do not need much. Nobody ever needs much until they do. He gave her hydrated lime sand, and the horsehair in a smaller sack that smelled faintly of barn dust and time. Then he wrote the ratios in the ledger and made her repeat them. Scratch coat, 1 part lime putty to 2½ parts sharp sand, enough hair to bind, not enough to clump. Brown coat, similar. A little less hair built to 3/8 of an inch. Finish coat, fine sand, lime, thin, 1/8 inch, smooth but not glassy. Dampen the old edges, press the first coat through the lath, score it. Wait, do not rush the brown coat. 72 hours minimum where the room stayed warm enough. Keep air moving, not wind. Plaster dries by leaving, Alden said. Lime cures by taking in. Sienna wrote that down too, because some sentences were tools. The removal took a morning. She cut around the failed patches with the utility knife, not sawing wildly, only defining the damage. Loose plaster came away in chunks and powder, revealing oak lath split by hand, uneven and still strong, except where water had softened 2 narrow strips. She replaced those with salvaged cedar lath, only after debating whether mixing woods mattered. Alden said the wall would not complain if the strips were sound, keyed and fastened. She cleaned the cavity with a brush, misted the old lath, and mixed the scratch coat in a pan on the floor. Lime changed the room. It had a mineral smell, wet stone, and old barns after rain. The horsehair dispersed reluctantly at first, gathering in ropes until she learned to tease it through her fingers and fold it into the mix instead of stirring as if making batter. The right texture was not pretty. It was fibrous, firm, willing to hold to a trowel without sliding. Pressing it through the lath required confidence she did not feel. The first handful fell back onto the drop cloth. The second clung. She pushed harder, feeling the plaster squeeze between the oak strips and mushroom behind them. Keys, that was the word. The wall held not because the face was smooth, but because hidden shapes had gripped the back. She scored the scratch coat in diagonal lines with a broken comb from the workroom. For the next 3 days, the patches became part of her hourly life. She checked the stove, checked the water, checked the surface. Too dry. She misted lightly. Too cold, she built a small fire and kept it low. At night, she hung cloth around the work area to preserve warmth without trapping damp. The room smelled of lime, smoke, beeswax, and pine floor oil. It was not a pleasant smell in the simple sense. It was a working smell. It told the truth. The brown coat went on thicker. 3/8 measured not by guess but by 2 small strips of scrap wood. Alden told her to tack temporarily at the edges, fill to the strips, rule off with a straight board, remove strips, fill the gap. She did this slowly, drawing the board upward, watching high places shave away and low places reveal themselves. The wall was not flat by modern standards and would not become so. She followed its old plane. She did not erase the slight wave where hands in 1931 had worked with a different rhythm. After 72 hours, she mixed the finish coat. This plaster was finer, quieter under the trowel, almost creamy once the lime took the water. She laid it thin, 1/8 inch, feathering into the old surface with small movements. Too much pressure polished it. Too little left ridges. She found a middle way after spoiling the first edge and scraping it back before it set. At the final patch above the stove, her hand steadied. The trowel moved in a clean arc. The new plaster met the old without pretending to be original. When she stepped back, the repairs were visible, and she was glad. Pale islands on an aged wall. Honest where damage had been, she washed the tools outside in a bucket, never in the creek, then spread them to dry. Inside, the patches held their damp brightness in the dusk. She stood with her hands at her sides, breathing carefully because the room seemed to have gained another layer of steadiness. These patches will hold another 100 years. She did not say it aloud. It was not a boast. It was a hope set into lime. The first paper bag appeared on the back step the morning after she finished the plaster. It was folded neatly at the top and weighted with a jar of applesauce. Inside were 4 potatoes, a heel of bread wrapped in wax paper, 2 boiled eggs marked with pencil crosses, and a note written on the back of a cafe receipt. Pay me in candles when the shop reopens. Doris. Sienna knew Doris only by sight then. Doris ran the small cafe near the crossing, a square white building attached to an old gas station canopy where pumps had been removed years ago. The sign read Doris's table in red letters that had faded to a softened pink. Trucks stopped there early. Orchard men, snowplow drivers, 1 deputy, 2 women who worked at the farm office, and Walter Beck on Fridays when his daughter drove him. Sienna had gone in once to buy coffee with coins and had stayed near the door because every chair seemed to belong to someone already. Doris was broad-hipped, grey-haired and brisk in the manner of women who had carried plates through arguments for 40 years without dropping one. She wore blue aprons over sweaters, kept pencils in her bun, and called every person by name unless she chose not to. When Sienna had come in that first time, Doris had set the coffee down before taking payment and pushed the sugar closer without comment. Now her bags arrived twice a week. Never lavish, never enough to make refusal simple. A carrot split down the middle but clean, 2 biscuits. A cabbage with its outer leaves removed, a small jar of chicken soup, a folded cloth containing slices of ham trimmed from the end. Once a piece of cherry pie in a square of foil, its crust broken, its filling dark and tart. Each bag had a note with the same terms. In candles. Sienna walked to the cafe after the 3rd delivery, carrying the empty jars washed and wrapped in cloth. Doris was wiping the counter when she entered. 5 men turned to look and then turned back because Doris looked at them first. I cannot keep taking food, Sienna said. Doris took the jars, inspected their clean rims, and set them under the counter. You are not taking. I'm extending credit. I do not have a shop. You have a building with a sign. It is not open. Then the debt is not due. The men at the counter studied their coffee. Sienna lowered her voice. I do not know when I can make candles worth selling. Doris looked at her over the rims of glasses she wore only for reading tickets. Worth and Perfect are cousins who do not visit often. Bring what burns clean. The next supporting hand came on a Saturday afternoon with the sound of a bicycle in slush. Sienna was outside splitting kindling with the roofing hatchet when a boy coasted down the lane on an old red Schwinn, one boot dragging for a brake. He was 16, perhaps narrow at the wrists, with dark hair falling over his forehead and a patched army coat too large in the shoulders. A splitting maul lay across the handlebars, tied with baling twine. He stopped near the walnut tree and looked at the woodpile without introducing himself. "You doing that with a roofing hatchet?" Sienna glanced at the tool in her hand. "For kindling." "For rounds?" "No." He considered the answer. "Good." Then he untied the maul and began splitting the larger pieces. Alden had delivered in exchange for future payment and present common sense. His swing was awkward but strong, more will than technique at first. Sienna stopped him before he buried the maul in frozen dirt and showed him how to set a round on a chopping block, how to widen his stance, how to let the tool fall through the wood instead of trying to muscle it apart. He listened with the sober attention of a boy who had come to help and found himself being taught. "What is your name?" she asked. "Caleb." "Caleb, what?" "Marks." He split 3 rounds before adding, "My mother said." "About your grandfather." Sienna stood with the next piece of wood in her hand. "My grandfather?" "Or great?" "I do not know." "Voss." He shrugged, embarrassed by uncertain genealogy. "She said her grandmother had asthma and your people brought buckwheat honey every winter. Would not take money when the mill shut down." Sienna did not know that story. It entered her quietly and took a place among the others. Caleb came after school twice a week when weather allowed, riding the Schwinn with the maul tied to the handlebars and a paper sack of something from his mother in the rear basket. He would not take money. When Sienna tried to give him $2 from the tin after a week of wood, he stepped back as if she had offered him a snake. "No." "You worked," my mother said. "Your mother is not here." He looked down the lane, then back at her. "She will be when I get home." That ended the matter. He split wood, carried water when the pump handle froze, held sash while she tied cords, and asked questions about the extractor in a way that made clear he wanted to touch it but had been raised not to touch another person's tools. She let him turn the crank after she cleaned and oiled the gear housing. It moved only a few inches at first, then farther, groaning under old grease. Caleb grinned before catching himself. "Heavy?" he said. "Patient," Sienna answered. The third presence did not bring food or tools or labor. Reverend Boyd walked past every morning. He was the minister of a small white church 2 miles east, though Sienna learned that only after Doris told her. He was tall and thin, with a brown hat, black overcoat, and a scarf tied once at the neck. His face was dark and deeply lined, his beard trimmed close and silver at the chin. Each morning around 7 he walked Grey Road for the health of his heart, turned down Honey House Road as far as the Walnut windbreak, then returned. At first Sienna saw only his figure beyond the plastic windows moving through blue coal. The first time she was outside, she tipped his hat. "'S'morning?" "'S'morning." That was all. The next day he tipped his hat again. On the third, she paused at the fallen sign and looked toward the roofwork. On the fourth, when Sienna was carrying a bucket of ash out back, she stopped long enough to say, "Lord, keep you steady." 4 words. Then he walked on. He did not ask whether she attended church. He did not ask what had brought her there. He did not offer scripture like a blanket thrown over a person whose wounds he had not seen. He simply passed each morning, tipped his hat if she was visible, and gave, once or twice a week. Another prayer no longer than a hinge. "Mercy walk beside you. Hands find their work. Peace under this roof." The prayers did not demand response. That made them possible to receive. By late February, the honey house had a pattern of visitors without ever becoming public. Doris's bags came by the back step. Caleb's bicycle tracks braided the slush near the woodpile. Reverend Boyd's boot prints appeared on the lane and vanished with each new frost. Alden's ledger grew by careful lines and occasional credits when Sienna carried back clean jars, sorted nails, or repaired hive boxes for resale. Walter came rarely, corrected one thing, and left before gratitude could gather too much weight. The house had been waiting longer than she had been running. Now, slowly, others waited with it, not intruding, not claiming, only standing near enough that when Sienna reached for the next piece of work, she sometimes found another pair of hands already holding one end. Sienna postponed the cellar until February 11th. She had known the door was there from the first week. It lay under a trap in the back room, half hidden by a sheet of tin, and 2 empty hive bodies stacked by someone who may have intended to return before winter and never did. The pull ring was iron, rusted but whole. Cold air slipped up through the cracks around it, carrying a mineral damp unlike the marsh or the well stone, earth, root, time below human rooms. She did not open it because the roof had mattered more, then heat, then windows, then walls. Also because below was another unknown, and unknowns had to wait their turn. On February 11th, the morning broke clear at 24 degrees, with sun on the walnut branches and no wind. Caleb had shoveled the back step the previous afternoon. Alden had loaned her a lantern, rope, and a rule spoken so sternly it needed no writing. "Do not go down if the air is wrong." She asked how to know. "You trust the flame before you trust yourself." So she lit the lantern and set it near the seam after moving the hive bodies away. The flame burned steady. She opened the trap 1 inch. The smell rose stronger, damp stone and old leaves. The flame wavered but did not shrink. She waited, opened it wider. The hinges protested in a low iron groan, then settled. 7 granite steps led down. Each step was a single block, worn slightly in the center by feet long gone. The walls were fieldstone, dry-laid in places and mortared in others, with roots entering through the upper seams like brown threads. She lowered the lantern first on a rope, watching the flame. It held. Then she descended, one hand on the wall, boots finding the worn centers carefully. The cellar measured about 12 by 15 feet, larger than she expected and colder than the room above. The floor was fieldstone, uneven but deliberate, sloping toward a shallow drain channel that disappeared beneath the rear wall. Shelves lined one side, most collapsed, though a few thick planks remained on stone supports. Old jars sat there empty or cloudy with mineral bloom. A wooden barrel had fallen apart in the corner, iron hoops lying around it like discarded bracelets. At the center of the floor was a single dressed granite slab. It did not belong to the rougher stones around it. It had been cut square and set with care, perhaps 3 feet by 3 feet, its top worn smooth. In the center was carved the same mark Sienna had found beneath the walnut tree, a bee within a square, one corner open. The cuts here were deeper, protected from weather, and the bee's wings showed fine lines she had not seen outside. She knelt and brushed dirt from the carving. The slab did not move under her hands. She did not try harder. Some doors announce themselves before they are ready to open, and by then she had learned not every secret must be lifted the day it is found. The brass strip outside had named Andrew's hook. The cellar mark named something else. Later. Not now. She rose and continued examining the walls. There was no treasure under loose stones, no second tin, no dramatic hollow echo, only the honest remains of storage, bits of broken crockery, a jar of hardened mineral salt, 2 bent zinc lids, a coil of wire, and a mouse skull white as a seed. The cellar's gift at first seemed to be stability. The foundation walls below the worst corner were better than the outside had suggested. Damp, yes. Shifted in 2 places, but not collapsed. The honey house had stronger feet than its bowed shoulders implied. On the way back up, the lantern light caught something under the 3rd step. A dark line where there should have been only shadow. Sienna stopped with one boot on the 4th step and crouched awkwardly, holding the lantern near the riser. An object had been wedged beneath the overhang of the 3rd granite tread, tucked against the side wall and hidden by dust. Not a package. Not cloth. Wood. She worked it loose with the thin hive tool. It was a small oak box, no larger than 2 hands, with a sliding lid swollen tight by years of damp. The wood was blackened at the edges but sound. No lock. No label. She carried it upstairs before opening it because some finds belonged first in daylight. On the extraction table, she warmed the box near the stove and rubbed the lid with a cloth. It moved a fraction. then another. When it slid free, the smell that came out was not decay but dry oak and metal. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph. The key was heavy, its shaft plain, its bit cut in 3 square steps. The bow had been shaped like the craft mark, a bee inside an open-cornered square, though softened by hand filing. It had been wrapped in a strip of faded blue ribbon, brittle now, tied once through the bow. Sienna turned it over in her palm. No door in the honey house had a lock worthy of it. The tin type was wrapped in tissue so thin it had become nearly transparent. She lifted it by the edges and carried it to the east window. A young woman stood in front of this cottage. Not the honey house exactly as Sienna knew it. The boards looked fresh. The sign was new. The walnut tree behind it was thinner, though already rising with intention. The woman wore a long dark skirt, a white blouse and an apron. Her hair was pinned up, but loose strands framed a face that made Sienna stop breathing for several seconds. The face was hers, and not hers. Same long line of cheek. Same mouth held closed when the heart had too much to say. Same eyes set as if watching weather approach from 2 directions. The young woman held a hive tool in one hand and a wooden frame in the other. Bees blurred around the comb in small dark flecks. On the back of the photograph, in ink still legible, was written, Miriam Clara Voss, daughter of Abel's son Henrik, age 25, summer of 1903. Sienna read the line twice. Eleonora's mother. The woman from the letter. A face carried forward through generations without permission or explanation, arriving now in a room where no family had come to claim it. She set the photograph beside the letter, the medal, and the tools. The brass key she placed on the mantel above the stove where firelight could find it. For days after she would glance at it while carrying water, sanding a frame, patching a sash, or banking embers before sleep. It gave no answer, it did not need to. A key can be an instruction even before a lock appears. The granite slab waited below. Sienna let it wait. March did not arrive as spring. It arrived as water. Snow retreated first from the lane, then from the south side of the honey house, then from the orchard rows beyond Grey Road, where black earth began appearing in long strips. The creek grew loud with snowmelt, losing its winter carefulness and speaking now with stones in its mouth. At night, meltwater ticked from the eaves into buckets she no longer needed to place in the old locations, and that absence became its own comfort. The roof held, the repaired windows fogged and cleared, the plaster paled as it cured. Walnut catkins appeared in April, soft and greenish, hanging from branches that had looked dead for months. The chickadees came more often. Red-winged blackbirds took the marsh and argued over reeds. One morning, Sienna opened the back door and smelled wet soil instead of frozen grass. It was not warmth yet, but it was permission. The map of wild colonies remained folded most days. When she did open it, she did so with clean hands and enough time. The red circles seemed to pulse on the paper, each mark a living question. Some were near roads she had walked in hunger, some lay beyond farms whose names she knew only from mailboxes. Some were on land that might now belong to people who cut trees for convenience, or people who sprayed without reading labels, or people who would not welcome a woman asking about bees in a hollow beach. The map was not a command to rush, it was a record asking not to be wasted. Alden expected her to start with equipment in April. He did not say it, but he had set aside 2 serviceable hive bodies. A smoker bellows leather he thought could be repaired, and a veil without tears. Caleb wanted bees immediately, because 16-year-old boys often believe spring exists to begin everything at once. Doris had already cleared one shelf near the cafe door and told 3 customers there would be honey candles someday, though she added, "Do not ask when," with the authority of a woman guarding bread in the oven. Sienna decided not to begin the craft that spring. The decision took longer than the sentence. She had money enough now to buy packages, equipment, feed, tools, books, lumber, and perhaps even a used truck if she wanted foolishness dressed as necessity. But Eleonora's letter had been plain. Begin smaller than hunger. Watch first, return 3 times, treat wild colonies as teachers. Do not mistake feeding for keeping. Do not let money become noise. So she made a different plan. She would order wax, wick, and mold supplies using 1 coin from the tin, a common silver $half too worn for collector pride but marked in the inventory. She would spend it carefully, record it, and place the receipt with the money. She would practice candles before colonies, frame repair before swarm capture, smoke control before hive opening. She would build 2 hive boxes from cedar, not to fill immediately but to learn square, true, and weather-tight. She would visit the first red circle on the map only to observe. No cutting, no taking. A notebook, binoculars borrowed from Alden, and time. The first small samples failed. 1 candle tunneled because the wick was wrong. 1 cracked because she cooled it near the window. 1 smelled faintly scorched because she let the wax rise above 180 degrees while distracted by a knock at the door. She wrote each failure down. Temperature, time, wick size, mold cooling place. Weather she learned the way Ruth had taught her, with less romance and more correction. By mid-April, she had 6 clean-burning candles no taller than her thumb. She took 2 to Doris in a paper wrap. Doris lit 1 on the cafe counter between lunch and supper, watched the flames settle, and nodded once. That will do. Not praise. Better than praise. Outside, the fruit trees began to show tight buds. The marsh filled with evening frogs. The honey house held the day's warmth a little longer after sunset, and when Sienna banked the stove, she could sometimes sit without wrapping the burlap around her shoulders. The brass key waited on the mantel. The granite slab waited below. The old extractor waited in the workroom, cleaned but not yet returned to service. On the shelf, the first 6 candles stood beside Eleonora's letter, each one small, imperfect, and burning toward a future that did not need to arrive loudly. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, snow came early and stayed. The lane froze under a hard crust by the 2nd week, and the walnut tree stood black above it with the brass plate in its trunk still hidden beneath bark and weather. The honey house no longer looked rescued from the road. It looked kept. Not polished, not transformed into something suitable for magazines or weekend visitors in linen coats, but kept in the deeper sense. The roof lay straight enough to shed snow. The windows held light. Smoke rose from the fieldstone chimney in a clean column that bent over the marsh and disappeared among the cedars. Inside, Sienna poured her first completed heritage craft product just after dawn on December 14th. Not honey, not yet. The bees came later and slowly, by swarm and permission, and even then she refused to call them hers in the old way. This first finished thing was a set of 12 beeswax candles poured in the original tin molds using wax rendered from cappings gathered from 2 local keepers, blended with a small portion of the dark cakes Eleonora had hidden no more than necessary to carry the scent forward. She had tested wick sizes all autumn. Number 2 square braid for the narrow tapers. Cotton primed in wax at 165 degrees. Molds warmed near the stove, not hot. Wax held between 172 and 76, poured in a thin stream, topped off after shrinkage, cooled away from drafts. She made notes on every line. The candles released from the molds with a soft, satisfying slide, each one holding the faint seam of the tin and the pale gold color of late-season wax. Not perfect, one leaned slightly. One had a shallow scar where an air bubble had risen. One carried a darker streak from the older wax, a thread of amber running down one side like a memory refusing to be blended out. She set that one aside for herself. On the table, the 12 candles stood in 2 rows. The honey house had given back light. The restored interior remained modest. The front room held the cleaned counter, the old scale, 2 shelves of jars, a ledger, a kettle, a chair Caleb had mended, and the stove with its black surface rubbed down each Saturday. The plaster patches still showed paler than the rest, because Sienna never painted over them. The floor had darkened again under use, honey-coloured in the walking path, mahogany near the stove, nearly black where the extractor workroom began. The east window still bent the walnut branches into watery shapes on bright mornings. In the workroom, the extractor stood bolted to its platform, cleaned, oiled, and honest about every dent. The hidden compartment had not been sealed again. Sienna had lined it with cedar and used it now to store the letter, the map, and a copy of her own notes, wrapped but accessible. On the wall hung the fine hive tool, the repaired smoker, 2 veils, the small carpenter's square, and Ruth's canvas satchel, folded on a peg below the old sign. The brass key remained on the mantel until the second winter had made Sienna ready for the question it carried. She found the lock on a Sunday afternoon after a thaw. For months she had assumed the key belonged to the granite slab in the cellar, though she had never found a keyhole there. The slab remained unmoved, and she had kept her promise to leave it until the future asked more clearly. But that winter, while clearing ice from the back steps, she noticed a seam in the walnut trunk beneath the horseshoe. It was not a natural split. The bark around it had grown thick, but a straight edge remained beneath moss and lichen. She returned with a soft brush, a wooden scraper, and the patience of all the work that had led her there. Under the moss was a brass plate set into the living wood. The tree had grown around it, gripping but not swallowing it. The plate bore the same B and square mark as the cellar slab and the key bow. At its centre was a narrow keyway, green with age. Sienna stood with her hand on the trunk for a long while before going inside. The brass key fit on the first try. It did not turn at once. She warmed it in her palm, worked a drop of oil into the lock, and waited. The second attempt moved the mechanism a fraction. The third released it with a click so small the walnut leaves, had there been leaves, might have hidden it. A panel no larger than a bread box opened inward. Inside the hollow was a metal cylinder wrapped in oilcloth. The space was dry, cedar-lined, and faintly aromatic. Sienna carried the cylinder to the work table before unwrapping it. Her hands were steady, though she paused twice to clean them, once after touching the bark, once after lifting the lid. Within lay a folded 48 star flag and a note tied with blue thread. The flag was small, perhaps the kind carried or displayed in a window, its cotton faded but intact. 48 stars, arranged in neat rows belonging to a country before Alaska and Hawaii, before much that Sienna had ever known. Folded inside it was a pressed sprig of something dry and unidentifiable, perhaps clover, perhaps yarrow. The note was dated 1919, to whoever keeps the house after we are gone. This flag was in the window when the telegram came for Samuel. It remained there until the armistice bells stopped ringing in town. And then I folded it, because a house cannot live forever in the moment of news. Samuel loved the bees before he loved the uniform, and if there is justice beyond our seeing, he has found a country where no smoke rises from burning hives and no mother must learn the weight of a medal. Do not display this for pride. Keep it for witness. Miriam Clara Voss. October 30th, 1919. Sienna read the note beside Eleonora's letter, the two voices separated by decades and joined by the same careful hand of keeping. The great-great-grandmother from the photograph had hidden grief in the tree rather than on a wall, not secrecy from shame, preservation from misuse. There are sorrows that become smaller when shown too often to careless eyes, and there are sorrows that grow more honourable when kept until the right hand opens them. She did not unfold the flag fully at first. She cleared the table, washed her hands, and called Reverend Boyd, who by then had become less a morning passer-by and more a quiet part of the house's weather. He came that afternoon in his brown hat and black coat, carrying no Bible because she had not asked for ceremony. Together they unfolded the flag only enough to confirm its condition, then refolded it along existing creases. The Reverend read the note once, lips moving without sound. "Keep for witness," he said. Yes. On November 11th, 2024, before the snow came, Sienna had taken Samuel's medal to Oakwood Cemetery in Traverse City, where a veterans' observance was held each year under bare maples and a sky usually too cold for the coats people wore. She did not stand at the microphone. She did not introduce herself to committees. She carried the medal in its flannel, placed a small beeswax candle at the base of a stone marker for Great War veterans, and stood behind the last row while names were read. When the ceremony ended, an older man in a VFW cap noticed the ribbon and asked whether she needed help identifying it. She said no, thank you. It had been identified long enough. Then she took the medal home, wrapped it again, and placed it beside the flag note in the cedar-lined compartment of the extractor, where witness did not require display. The money remained mostly untouched. This was not because Sienna had no need. Need had not vanished. Taxes came. Roofing demanded better work. The well required a proper cover. Then a pump inspection. Then repairs that cost more than any single winter of courage could pay. The stove needed parts. The sill needed attention. Glass, lime, nails, oil, fuel, seed jars, wick, and insurance all required their portion. But the cash was not an open purse. It was an inheritance of attention, and attention does not spend itself loudly. She used only 3 coins at first. 1 worn silver $half for candle supplies. 1 roll of wheat pennies sold to a collector through Alden's cousin to buy the proper respirator filters. 1 common quarter from a duplicate roll to pay the county copy fee when she recorded the first repair certification. Later, after long consideration, she used 2 more coins toward the well cover because a hidden hole in the earth was not thrift, but danger. Every withdrawal went in the ledger. Date, item, amount, reason, coin or bill source, balance, receipt folded behind the page. The rest she resealed in waxed bundles, placed inside a fireproof box Alden found at an estate sale, and hid not where Eleonora had hidden it, but in a newer, safer place known only to Sienna, and written in the letter she began for whoever might come after. On the outside of that box she wrote, "For the next one. If there is need." The shop reopened without announcement. Doris did it, in the manner of women who know that asking permission gives other people a chance to make the matter foolish. One Tuesday in late October, she pinned an index card to the corkboard beside notices for firewood, piano lessons, snow tires, and a missing orange cat. Honey house candles, small Butch beeswax. Ask Doris for list. No phone number. No website. No photograph. No claim about heritage beyond what the candles themselves could bear. Sienna found out 2 days later when Caleb came in grinning and tried not to grin. My mother signed up. For what? The list. What list? He enjoyed that more than he should have. By Thanksgiving, Doris had a mailing list of 43 names written in a spiral notebook she kept under the register. Not email, mailing. Some wanted 2 candles, some wanted 6 for Christmas. One woman from Sutton's Bay asked for 12 and a note explaining the wax scent because her sister in Ohio missed Michigan orchards and cried at ordinary things since her husband died. Sienna filled orders slowly, each one wrapped in brown paper, tied with cotton string, labeled by hand. She did not become known. She became reliable. There is a difference, and the difference saved her. People did not line up down the road. No newspaper came, no television van. No stranger arrived to turn the honey house into a symbol large enough to crush the person inside it. The cafe corkboard, a few handwritten notes, Doris's stern recommendations and quiet word from one household to another brought enough work to matter and not enough to make the place noisy. Sienna kept shop hours only on Saturdays from 10 to 2, and if weather was poor, she put a card on the door that said "Closed for road conditions," because no candle was worth a broken hip in the lane. Caleb returned with the sign on a clear afternoon in December. He was taller by then, his wrists less narrow, his hair cut short because he had started part-time work at Klein Hardware, and Alden would not tolerate bangs near moving equipment. He drove his mother's old station wagon instead of the Schwinn, though the bicycle still leaned sometimes against the walnut tree when he came to split wood out of habit. In the back of the wagon, wrapped in a quilt, lay a plank of cedar he had carved himself. He would not let Sienna help carry it. The sign was long, hand-planned, the edges beveled clean. He had carved the letters deep and steady, not machine perfect, but better because of it. At the left was the B in the open square. At the centre were the words, Voss Honey House, candles, wax, hive work, and daughters. Sienna read the last line and then looked at him. Caleb shifted the sign against his hip. Plural, I see that. Sounded better, did it? He looked toward the walnut tree, then at the front wall where the old co-op sign still hung in weathered fragments. Not just blood daughters. That is what my mother said. And Doris? And Alden said if I made the letters too shallow, weather would eat them by Easter. He had carved them deep. They hung it beneath the remains of the original sign, not replacing the old words but answering them. Walter came in his green truck and criticized the first placement by half an inch. Reverend Boyd held one end while Caleb adjusted the brackets. Doris stood in the lane with a thermos of coffee and pretended not to direct everyone. Alden supplied brass screws and said nothing when Sienna tried to pay. When the sign settled into place, the honey house seemed to exhale. And daughters. Plural made room. Not for fame. Not for romance. Not for the family that had failed to arrive when arrival would have mattered. It made room for any careful hand that might one day need a craft, not because craft solves grief, but because it gives grief a place to sit while the hands do necessary work. That night, after everyone left, Sienna lit the candle with the amber streak and set it on the writing table beneath the east window. Snow had begun falling again, fine and deliberate. The new sign moved slightly in the wind, then stilled. She took out cream paper from a drawer, the best she owned, and uncapped a fountain pen Alden had repaired for her from a box of unsorted estate items. She began her own letter. Not because she expected to die soon, not because the house demanded drama, because a person who has been kept by words owes words to the future. She wrote the first line exactly as it had been given to her. My dear one, whoever you are. Then she stopped and listened. The room held, the stove breathed, the extractor stood in the workroom with its cedar-lined compartment open, waiting for additions. On the mantel, the brass key rested beside the small carpenter's square. Ruth's canvas satchel hung below the old tools, no longer a refugee's bag, no longer dirty in anyone's mouth, but a piece of cloth that had carried a life across the distance between leaving and being received. Sienna wrote slowly. She wrote that the house had been condemned when she came. She wrote that the roof had failed in 3 places, and that roof work should begin where weight travels, not where panic points. She wrote Alden's sentence about smoke rising and creosote running down. She wrote the mortar ratios. She wrote DAP 33 and cotton sash cord and the warning about oil rags. She wrote that Doris accepted payment in candles before candles existed. She wrote that Caleb carved the sign. She wrote Reverend Boyd's 4-word prayers. She wrote Walter's corrections, including the one about a proud nail. She did not write everything. Some things belonged only to the body that survived them. She did not name Cole. She did not record Lydia's 8 words. She did not leave instructions on how to endure a person who turns fear into a household rule. The house was not a monument to what harmed her. It was a record of what remained and what had been mended. Near midnight, she set the pen down and folded the first page along no crease, because it was not finished. It would take years, perhaps. Good letters sometimes should. She went outside before sleep. Snow had softened the lane. The walnut tree stood with the horseshoe in its east fork. The hidden brass plate closed again beneath moss and bark. The new sign was white along its top edge, the carved letters gathering shadow. From the marsh came the low winter sound of water moving where ice had not sealed it. The honey house behind her showed light through the east window, wavy and warm, not much, but enough to tell the road that someone was there. She stood a while, breathing smoke, snow, hedar, and beeswax. The house had been waiting longer than she had been running, and now she was no longer running. A honey extraction house waits. It has always waited. It waits under cedar shake and fieldstone, under plaster patched by a tired woman in late February, under window glass salvaged from other weather, under the patient smell of wax that does not forget the flowers it came from. It waits for hands that arrive empty, careful, cold, and exact. It waits for the person who does not know yet that keeping a place can become a way of being kept. In the county building. Miriam Holt was near retirement by then. She had new glasses, a softer chair, and a drawer that still did not balance in the official sense because certain odd things remained kept separate. Wrapped in a pencil-marked slip was the same wrinkled dollar bill Sienna had placed on the counter on that November morning. Parcel number, date, Voss Honey House. Miriam had meant to send it through properly more than once, but each time her hand had paused. Some payments are legal, some are witness. On her last winter week in the office, Miriam opened the middle drawer, saw the soft old bill, and smiled with her mouth closed. Then she shut the drawer gently, leaving it there for the next careful clerk to find and wonder over. A single dollar kept in the silence between record and mercy.